Tonight, we are going to explore a very slow and boring history. This story is designed to help you relax, unwind, and gently fall asleep. So find a comfortable position, close your eyes, and let's begin. Picture a room lit only by lamplight, papers scattered across a desk, ancient texts translated from languages most people have never heard of. And in the center of it all, someone sits alone in the deep hours of the night, reading the same story over and over again. Not because it's compelling, though it is, but because it shouldn't exist. The Sumerians told it 4,000 years ago, pressed into clay tablets that survived when their cities turned to dust. The Mayans carved it into stone in jungles half a world away. The Hopi passed it down through generations in the American Southwest. Aboriginal Australians sang it in ceremonies, stretching back to when the coastlines looked different than they do today. The Norse whispered it around fires in frozen lands. The Hindus wrote it in Sanskrit. The Chinese recorded it as history. They all remembered. These weren't cultures that traded with each other. They didn't share languages or writing systems. The distance between them could be measured in thousands of miles and thousands of years. The Mayans never heard of Mesopotamia. The Aboriginal Australians never met the ancient Greeks. The Hopi never encountered the Hindus. Yet somehow, impossibly, they were all telling the same story. A warning comes from the divine or from dreams. A family is chosen. A boat must be built. Animals must be saved. The waters rise higher than the mountains. Everything drowns. The boat finds land on a peak. Humanity begins again from almost nothing. These aren't vague similarities. These are specific, repeated details appearing in over 200 different cultures across every inhabited continent on Earth. They all remembered the divine warning. They all remembered the boats. They all remembered the animals. They all remembered the mountains covered by water. They all remembered landing on high ground when the waters finally fell. They all remembered that humanity nearly ended, that we came within a breath of extinction, that everything had to begin again. How is this possible? The Hopi in Arizona never sailed to Mesopotamia. The Aboriginal Australians never walked to India. The ancient Sumerians never crossed the Pacific to teach the Mayans. These cultures developed in isolation, separated by oceans that couldn't be crossed with their technology, divided by mountain ranges and deserts, and distances so vast that contact was impossible. Yet the stories match, not just in theme, but in detail. Not just in concept, but in structure. Statistical analysis has been done. The probability of this happening by chance is so small, it might as well be zero. The specific elements, the number of days, the categories of animals, the landing on mountaintops, the sending of birds to test for dry land, the offering of thanks, the covenant or promise that follows. These details repeat with a consistency that defies explanation through independent invention. They all remembered because something happened. Something real. Something so catastrophic and so universal that it burned itself into human memory across the entire world. And that memory survived. It survived the collapse of civilizations. It survived migrations across continents. It survived thousands of years of oral transmission before writing even existed. It survived because the people who lived through it made absolutely certain their children would know, and their children's children, and every generation that followed. The question isn't whether they remembered. The evidence is overwhelming that they did. The question is what they remembered. What actually happened? And why, after all these thousands of years, are we only now beginning to take these stories seriously? Let's trace the pattern across the world. Let's see where these memories live and what they tell us. Begin in Mesopotamia, in the fertile valley between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where civilization first learned to write. The Epic of Gilgamesh speaks of Utnapishtim, warned by the god Ea that a flood would destroy all life. He builds a cube-shaped vessel, loads it with animals and craftsmen, and survives 7 days of storms so violent the gods themselves cower in fear. When the waters recede, his boat rests on a mountain. He sends out birds, first a dove, then a swallow, then a raven, to search for land, move east to India. The Matsya avatar tells of Manu, who saves a small fish that grows impossibly large and reveals itself as the god Vishnu. The fish warns of a flood that will destroy the world. Manu builds a boat, gathers seeds and animals, and rides out the deluge. The fish, now massive and horned, tows the boat to safety on a mountain peak in the Himalayas. From there, humanity begins again, further east to China. The legends speak of Gun and Yu battling catastrophic floods during the reign of Emperor Yao. Waters rose from earth and sky for generations, submerging mountains and plains. Yu worked for 13 years, dredging rivers and creating channels, fighting back waters that covered the world. Chinese historical texts treat this as the dividing line between prehistoric and historic China, a real event that changed everything, crossed the Pacific to the Americas. The Aztec cosmology describes the fourth sun, Nahui Atl, ending when the sky fell and the world drowned. Only one couple survived in a hollow log, beginning humanity again. The Mayan Popol Vuh tells of the wooden people destroyed by flood and darkness, the sky raining resin, the earth consumed by rising waters. In North America, the Ojibwe tell of Nanabojo warned of a great flood, surviving on a raft with animals, sending muskrat to dive for mud that becomes new land. The Hopi describe climbing through multiple worlds as each is destroyed by water, now living in the fourth world with prophecies of its eventual end. These peoples never met. The ocean between Asia and the Americas was an unbridgeable gap with their technology. The distances were impossible. The timeline stretches across thousands of years, yet the stories align. Divine or natural warning. Chosen survivors. Vessels built for salvation. Animals preserved. Waters covering the earth. Landing on high ground. New beginning. Sweep to Australia, where Aboriginal traditions maintain the longest continuous oral history on Earth. They speak of the time when the seas rose and swallowed the land, when islands disappeared and coastlines changed. Archaeological evidence confirms that their stories accurately describe sea level changes from 10,000 years ago. The memories are real. The transmission is reliable. What they remember happened. Circle back to the Mediterranean. The Greeks told of Deucalion and Pyrrha surviving Zeus's flood in a wooden chest, landing on Mount Parnassus, repopulating the earth by throwing stones that became people. The flood destroyed humanity for its wickedness. Only the righteous survived. North to Scandinavia. Norse mythology speaks of Ymir's blood flooding the world, drowning all giants except Bergelmir and his wife, who survived in a boat. And in the prophecies of Ragnarok, the sea will rise again, Jörmungandr will emerge, waters will cover the earth, everything will end before being reborn. Oceans apart, yet speaking the same truth. Separated by time and distance, united by memory. From the frozen Arctic to tropical islands, from desert civilizations to mountain peoples, from Asia to Europe to the Americas to Australia, they all remembered. The details match. The structure repeats. The pattern is undeniable. This isn't coincidence. This is something else entirely. So how do we explain this? How do we make sense of 200 cultures separated by oceans and millennia, all telling the same story? Scholars have proposed three main theories, and only one of them makes sense when you really think about it. The first explanation is coincidence. Floods are common, after all. Rivers overflow. Tsunamis strike coasts. Every culture experiences flooding at some point, so perhaps they all independently created similar stories, because water rising and destroying things is a universal human experience. It's logical. It's simple. It requires no conspiracy and no mystery. But can coincidence explain why they mention the same number of days? Why they describe the same categories of animals being saved? Why they all land on mountains specifically, not hills or plains? Why so many send out birds in the same sequence? Dove, then swallow, then raven. Why the survivors always offer thanks in the same way? Why divine warning comes before the flood in culture after culture? Coincidence might explain vague similarities. It cannot explain precise, repeated details that appear across isolated populations who never had contact. The second explanation is archetypal psychology. Carl Jung proposed that certain symbols and narratives exist in the collective unconscious, patterns hardwired into human psychology that emerge independently in different cultures. Floods represent chaos, destruction, cleansing, rebirth. Perhaps these myths don't describe real events, but rather express universal human fears and hopes through water symbolism. It's an elegant theory. It explains the similarities without requiring historical contact or actual catastrophe. But why would archetypal fears include specific technical details like boat dimensions? Why would the collective unconscious specify 7 days of rain or 40 days and nights? Why would psychological archetypes describe sending out birds to test for land? A practical navigation technique, not a psychological symbol. Why would myths contain details about which types of wood to use for construction? What pitch to seal the boats with? How many decks to build? These aren't symbolic elements. These are practical instructions preserved in narrative form. Which brings us to the third explanation, historical memory. What if these stories aren't myths at all? What if they're the oldest history books we have? What if something actually happened? Something catastrophic, something global, something so terrible that every culture that survived made absolutely certain their descendants would remember. This explanation requires us to take ancient peoples seriously. It requires believing that oral traditions can preserve accurate information across vast spans of time, and we know they can. Aboriginal Australian stories describe specific coastal locations that are now underwater, matching sea level changes from 10,000 years ago. The geology confirms the stories. The dating matches. What seemed like myth turns out to be memory. If oral tradition can accurately preserve 10,000 years of environmental change, why couldn't it preserve 10,000 years of catastrophic flooding? If Australian elders can pass down precise geographic knowledge across 400 generations, why couldn't Mesopotamian priests, Mayan scribes, Chinese historians, and Hopi storytellers preserve memories of real events through the same length of time? The difference between myth and history is often just whether we believe the people telling the story. We call it myth when we think they made it up. We call it history when we think they remembered. And after looking at 200 cultures all remembering the same catastrophe, all preserving the same warnings, all telling their children the same truth, maybe it's time we started calling these stories what they might actually be. History. The oldest history we have. The story of what happened when the world nearly ended, and only a few survived to remember. The oldest written story humanity still possesses isn't about the creation of the world. It isn't about the first king or the birth of the gods. It's about the day the entire world drowned. In the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, a story unfolds that was already ancient when it was pressed into clay 4,000 years ago. Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, seeks immortality after the death of his friend Enkidu. His journey takes him to Utnapishtim, the only human ever granted eternal life by the gods. And when Gilgamesh asks how this happened, Utnapishtim tells him a story that should be impossible. The god Ea came to him in a dream, not directly. The gods had agreed among themselves to destroy humanity, and speaking openly would break their pact. So Ea spoke to the wall of Utnapishtim's reed house, knowing the man inside would hear. The message was clear. Build a boat. Not a small fishing vessel, but something massive. A cube, 120 cubits on each side. 7 decks, sealed with bitumen inside and out. Divide the interior into compartments. Make it strong enough to survive what was coming. Utnapishtim obeyed. He gathered craftsmen and laborers. He loaded the vessel with animals of every kind, male and female. He brought aboard the seed of all living things. He invited the craftspeople themselves, preserving not just life but knowledge, not just animals, but the skills needed to rebuild civilization. When everything was ready, when the last person stepped aboard and the door was sealed, the storm began. For 7 days and 7 nights, the tempest raged. The text describes it with terrible beauty. The storm roared like a bull. The winds howled. The hurricane flattened everything in its path. Even the gods were terrified by what they'd unleashed. They cowered like dogs, crouching against the outer wall of heaven, watching the destruction below. Ishtar cried out in regret, her voice breaking. The olden days have turned to clay. She wept for humanity, for the world she'd helped destroy. On the seventh day, the storm stopped. The sea grew calm. Silence fell. Utnapishtim opened a hatch and looked out at a world transformed into an ocean. Everything was flat. Everything was water. The mountains were gone. The cities were gone. Humanity was gone. The tablet says he sat down and wept, tears running down his face as he stared at the endless expanse of water where the world used to be. The boat drifted until it struck something solid, Mount Nimush, where it lodged and held fast. The waters began to recede. On the seventh day after grounding, Utnapishtim sent out a dove. It found no place to land and returned. He sent out a swallow. It too returned. Finally, he sent out a raven. The raven flew away and didn't come back. Land existed again. Life could begin again. Utnapishtim disembarked. He made an offering on the mountain peak, burning cedar and myrtle. The gods smelled the sweet savor and gathered around the sacrifice like flies, the text says. A startling, almost undignified image. They were grateful. They'd regretted their decision to flood the earth. And in their gratitude, they granted Utnapishtim and his wife immortality, transforming them into something more than human. This story was written down around 2100 BCE, making it one of the oldest pieces of literature we possess. But it wasn't invented then. The scribes who pressed these tablets were copying from earlier sources, preserving something already ancient. And here's what matters. The Mesopotamians didn't treat this as fantasy. Gilgamesh was considered a real king who ruled around 2700 BCE. The flood wasn't mythology. It was history. The line between legend and fact, between story and record, didn't exist the way it does for us. This narrative predates the biblical flood account by at least 1,000 years. Yet the parallels are unmistakable. The divine warning, the boat, the animals, the duration of the storm, the birds sent to test for land, the mountain, the sacrifice, the covenant afterward. Either the later stories borrowed from this one, or they all drew from something even older, something that happened so long ago we can barely comprehend it. But this wasn't the only version the Mesopotamians told. There's an older one, stranger, with details that make modern readers uncomfortable. The Atrahasis epic predates Gilgamesh by several centuries, and its flood narrative is even more detailed. The story begins not with one hero's journey, but with the entire cosmic order. Humanity had multiplied across the earth. Cities teemed with people. Fields stretched to the horizon. And the gods, dwelling in heaven, couldn't sleep. The noise was too much. The clamor of human activity rose to heaven day and night. Voices, construction, trade, celebration, conflict, life itself creating an endless din. The god Enlil grew furious. He couldn't rest. He couldn't think. Humanity had become intolerable. So he convinced the other gods to wipe them out entirely. Flood would silence the noise forever. But Enki, the god of wisdom and water, couldn't bear to see humanity destroyed. He went to the reed house where Atrahasis, a devout man, lived. And like Ea in the later Gilgamesh version, Enki spoke to the wall, letting Atrahasis overhear the divine warning. Build a boat. Specific dimensions. Seal it with bitumen, coating every surface until it's waterproof. Roof it over completely. Bring aboard the animals. Save yourself and your family. Atrahasis worked day and night. The text describes his preparation in careful detail. The gathering of materials, the construction process, the loading of provisions. And when everything was ready, when the last pitch had been applied and the final supplies loaded, the flood began. 7 days and 7 nights, the same duration as Gilgamesh. The storm raged with such violence that even the gods who decreed the flood began to panic. They hadn't fully understood what they were unleashing. Water covered everything. The world they'd created was drowning before their eyes. And they realized, too late, that they'd made a terrible mistake. When the storm finally ended and the waters began to recede, Atrahasis's boat came to rest on a mountain. He opened the hatch. He sent out birds to search for land. When they confirmed the waters had fallen, he disembarked and made an offering on the mountaintop, burning sacrifices of thanks to the gods who'd saved him. The gods smelled the sweet savor and gathered around the sacrifice like flies. That image appears here too, identical to the later Gilgamesh version. They were starving, the text suggests. Without humans to make offerings, the gods had no sustenance. They'd nearly destroyed themselves along with humanity, and they regretted it. Enlil himself, who demanded the flood, saw Atrahasis and his family and realized that life had survived. Some part of creation had endured. The cosmic order could continue. What makes this version remarkable isn't just its age, though it is older than Gilgamesh, but its complexity. This isn't primitive mythology. It's sophisticated theology, wrestling with difficult questions. Why do gods create humans only to destroy them? Can divine beings make mistakes? What happens when cosmic forces regret their actions? The narrative doesn't offer simple answers. It sits with the tension, acknowledging that even gods can be wrong, that even divine judgment can go too far. And notice the details that repeat from this older version into the later Gilgamesh epic. 7 days. The boat sealed with bitumen. The birds sent out. The mountain. The sacrifice. The gods gathering like flies. These aren't variations. They're precise repetitions, suggesting both stories drew from the same source, preserving the same memory with remarkable consistency. The Mesopotamian scribes treated these texts as precious. They copied them carefully across generations, maintaining accuracy, preserving every detail. They weren't creating fiction. They were recording history, the history of how the world nearly ended and how it was saved. The flood wasn't metaphor. It was the dividing line in time, the catastrophe that separated before from after. The gods themselves regretted what they'd done. But it was too late. The water was already rising, and only the memory survived, pressed into clay, passed down through thousands of years, waiting for us to understand what it was trying to tell us. But the Mesopotamians weren't alone in the ancient Near East. Another culture was telling the same story, and their version would become the most famous flood narrative in human history. Scholars have long recognized that the biblical account of Noah draws heavily from these earlier Mesopotamian sources. The parallels are too precise to be coincidental. The divine decision to flood the earth, the selection of one righteous man, the instructions to build an ark with specific dimensions, the gathering of animals in pairs, the duration of the flood, the birds sent to test for land, the landing on a mountain, the sacrifice afterward, the covenant promising never to flood again. These similarities troubled early archaeologists when they first translated the Mesopotamian tablets in the 19th century. How could the Bible contain stories that predated it by over 1,000 years? The answer seemed obvious: cultural borrowing. The Hebrew scribes knew the Mesopotamian tales and adapted them, transforming polytheistic narratives into monotheistic teaching. But what if that's not quite right? What if both the Mesopotamian and biblical accounts drew from something even older? Consider what we know about Sumerian civilization. It appeared around 3300 BCE, remarkably sophisticated and seemingly fully formed. Advanced writing emerged suddenly. Complex mathematics appeared without visible developmental stages. Astronomical knowledge was already precise. Architecture was already monumental. The sophistication was there from the beginning, as if inherited rather than invented. The Sumerian king list is particularly fascinating. It records kings who ruled for thousands of years before the flood swept over the land. Then it lists different kings who ruled afterward, with more reasonable lifespans. The text treats the flood not as mythology, but as history. A real event that divided time, that changed everything, that separated the ancient world from the historical one. They didn't call it mythology. They called it history. The kings who ruled before the flood, and the kings who came after. What if the Mesopotamian scribes weren't inventing these stories, or even borrowing them from each other? What if they were preserving something older? Oral traditions passed down from actual survivors. Memories of real events wrapped in theological frameworks that made sense to their culture. We know oral traditions can preserve accurate information across staggering timespans. Aboriginal Australians maintain stories describing specific coastal locations that are now underwater. Geological studies confirm these locations existed above sea level 10 to 12,000 years ago. The stories match the science. The memory is real. What seemed like myth turns out to be preserved geography, passed down across 400 generations with surprising accuracy. If oral tradition can preserve 10,000 years of environmental change, why couldn't it preserve 10,000 years of catastrophic events? The Mesopotamian practice of copying and preserving ancient texts suggests they saw themselves as custodians, not creators. They were maintaining precious knowledge, keeping alive memories that couldn't be allowed to fade. Maybe the flood stories are old, far older than their written forms. Maybe they reach back to an actual event, something catastrophic enough that every survivor made certain their descendants would remember. The details were too important to lose. The warning was too vital to forget. So they told the story again and again, embedding it in their cultures so deeply that it survived migrations, survived the collapse of civilizations, survived the invention of writing, to finally be pressed into clay tablets that would last 4,000 years. But if this memory is so old, it should exist beyond Mesopotamia. It should appear in places that never heard of Gilgamesh or Noah. It should show up in cultures that had no contact with the ancient Near East, no trade routes to Babylon, no knowledge of Hebrew scripture, and it does. It appears everywhere, across oceans, across continents, in places the Mesopotamians never reached and never imagined, ever. The Aztecs knew the world had ended before, 4 times. The 4th time, it drowned. Their cosmology wasn't linear like ours. Time didn't march forward in a straight line from creation to present. Instead, it moved in cycles. Vast ages called suns, each one a complete world with its own humanity, its own rules, its own inevitable destruction. The Aztec priests kept meticulous records in codices, painted books that preserved their understanding of cosmic history. And those books told a disturbing story. The first sun ended in jaguars devouring humanity. The second sun was destroyed by hurricanes so powerful they transformed survivors into monkeys. The third sun ended in rains of fire. And the fourth sun, Nahui Atl, 4 water, ended when the sky itself fell and the world drowned beneath floods that lasted 52 years. 52 years. Not 40 days. Not 7 days. 52 years of water covering the earth. The codices depict this age with haunting images. Humans transforming into fish, their bodies changing to adapt to a world where land no longer existed. But most couldn't transform. Most simply drowned as the waters rose higher and higher, covering mountains, obliterating cities, erasing everything humanity had built. Only one couple survived. Their names were Tata and Nene. They hollowed out a great log, climbed inside, and floated on the endless waters, while the world died around them. When the flood finally ended, and they found land again, they were the only humans left. Everything had to begin from them. But the story doesn't end there. Tata and Nene were hungry. The waters had receded, but food was scarce. They caught fish, and this detail matters. They caught fish and made fire to cook them. The smoke rose into the sky, and the gods, looking down, became furious. Why? The codices don't explain fully, but the implication is clear. The survivors had violated some divine prohibition. Perhaps they weren't supposed to make fire yet. Perhaps they weren't supposed to eat the fish, which might have been transformed humans. Whatever the transgression, the gods punished them. They turned Tata and Nene into dogs. Humanity had to begin again from a different source, from people who would obey, who would remember their place in the cosmic order. We are living in the fifth sun now, according to Aztec chronology. This age will end too, eventually. The calendar stones depict its inevitable destruction. Everything ends. Everything is reborn. The cycles continue. What makes this remarkable isn't just the story itself, but the context. These aren't modern inventions. These accounts predate Spanish contact. The codices that survived, despite conquistadors burning hundreds of them, show that Aztec scholars treated this as genuine chronology, not metaphorical teaching. They were obsessed with time, with tracking cycles, with understanding patterns. Their calendars were among the most sophisticated in the ancient world. And those calendars, those chronologies, said the world had drowned before. How did they know? The Aztecs never met the Mesopotamians. They never read the Epic of Gilgamesh or heard the story of Atrahasis. They never encountered the biblical Noah. The Atlantic Ocean separated them from the Old World, an unbridgeable gap with their technology. Yet here they were, telling the same story. Catastrophic flood, divine decision, single surviving couple, water covering the earth, humanity nearly erased, beginning again from almost nothing. The parallels aren't vague. They're specific. Yes, the theological framework is different. Aztec gods, Aztec cosmology, Aztec worldview. But the underlying narrative structure matches. Something happened, something that involved water rising beyond all normal bounds, something that nearly ended humanity, something they remembered so clearly they built it into their understanding of time itself. And this memory wasn't confined to the Aztec Empire. To the south, in the jungles, another Mesoamerican civilization had recorded the same catastrophe, though they told it with different details and different emphasis. But the Aztecs weren't the only Mesoamerican civilization preserving flood memories. To the south, in the jungles, another culture had recorded the same catastrophe in different words. The Popol Vuh is the Quiche Mayan book of creation, transcribed in the 1550s by indigenous scholars who wrote down traditions that had been passed orally for generations, possibly from even older written sources that didn't survive. And like the Aztec codices, it speaks of multiple attempts at creating humanity, multiple failures, multiple destructions. The wooden people were the second attempt. The gods shaped them from wood, carved them carefully, gave them form and movement. But something was wrong. They walked and talked, but had no souls. They had no memory. They couldn't remember who made them or why they existed. They went through the motions of life but remained hollow, empty, without purpose or gratitude. The gods looked at what they'd created and felt only disappointment. These weren't humans. These were mockeries of humanity, animated wood with no inner light. So the gods decided to destroy them and try again. The flood came. But this wasn't just water. The sky itself darkened. Resin rained down, thick and sticky, coating everything. The earth became slippery with it. And then the waters rose, drowning the wooden people where they stood. But here's where the Popol Vuh becomes truly strange. As the wooden people tried to flee the rising waters, their own possessions turned against them. The grinding stones they'd used to make flour rose up and crushed their faces. The pots and griddles they'd used for cooking attacked them. Their dogs bit them, shouting accusations. You never fed us properly. You kicked us. You beat us. Even their turkeys joined in. You ate our kind. Now we'll eat you. Everything they'd mistreated, everything they'd taken for granted, became their destroyer. The wooden people ran for their houses, but the houses collapsed. They climbed trees, but the trees shook them off. They sought refuge in caves, but the caves sealed shut. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The world itself was rejecting them. Some survived by fleeing into the forest and climbing high into the branches. But they couldn't remain human. They transformed into monkeys, becoming something less than what they'd been, something diminished. You can still see them in the trees, the Popol Vuh says. The wooden people's descendants, reduced to animals. Then, from the survivors and from new attempts, humanity was created again. The third attempt, formed from maize, succeeded where wood had failed. But the memory of the flood remained, preserved in the sacred text. The gods had created humanity wrong, so they drowned them, and the survivors became something less than human. What makes this account powerful isn't just its vividness, though the image of grinding stones attacking their users is unforgettable, but its sophistication. This isn't simple mythology. It's exploring complex ideas about the relationship between humans and their environment, about gratitude and consequence, about what happens when beings forget their origins, and notice the details that echo other flood traditions. The divine dissatisfaction with humanity, the decision to destroy through water, the darkness that accompanies the flood, the near total destruction, the beginning again with new people. The structure is familiar, even as the specifics remain distinctly Mayan. The Mayans were sophisticated record keepers. Their mathematics was advanced. Their astronomy was precise. Their calendar systems tracked cycles stretching thousands of years. These weren't primitive peoples making up stories. They were scholars preserving knowledge, maintaining traditions they considered historically important. Two Mesoamerican civilizations, separated by centuries and hundreds of miles, both preserving flood memories, both treating these memories as chronology, not fantasy, both building them into their understanding of how the world works, both passing them down with care across generations. But the pattern extends north, where different peoples told different versions of the same truth. From the frozen north to the desert southwest, peoples who never met all told their children the same warning. The water had risen before. It could rise again. The Ojibwe, also called Anishinaabe, tell of Nanabojo, a spirit being who lived with the animals. One day, he received a warning. The water spirits were angry. A great flood was coming that would cover the earth. Nanaboja gathered the animals and built a large raft from logs. When the flood arrived, they floated together on the endless waters, surviving while everything else drowned. But floating wasn't enough. They needed land. Nanabojo asked the animals to dive down and retrieve mud from the bottom. Loon dove deep, but returned with nothing. Otter tried and failed. Duck vanished beneath the surface, but came back without mud. Finally, Muskrat volunteered. The little creature dove deeper than the others thought possible. Time passed. They began to fear Muskrat had drowned. But finally, barely alive, Muskrat surfaced with a tiny bit of mud clutched in his paw. Nanabojo took that mud and spread it on the water. It began to grow, expanding outward, becoming soil, becoming land. The earth was reborn from that small piece of mud. Life could begin again. The Hopi, in the desert southwest, tell a different version, but with the same core. They speak of emergence through multiple worlds. Humanity didn't originate in this world. They lived in a first world deep below, but it became corrupted and was destroyed. They climbed up to a second world. That too became corrupt and was destroyed by flood. They climbed to a third world. The same pattern repeated. Each time, the world ended. Each time, water rose and covered everything. Each time, a few survived by climbing higher, reaching the next level. We live in the fourth world now, and the prophecies say this world will end too, the same way. The Hopi warn that if people forget the old ways, if they stop living in balance, the water will rise again. It's not a distant myth. It's a living warning, repeated in ceremonies, embedded in their entire worldview. Move east to the Cree, who remember a great flood sent to purify the earth. West to the Lenape, who speak of a turtle's back becoming the foundation for new land after waters covered everything. South to the Cherokee, who tell of a flood that nearly destroyed humanity, with survivors taking refuge on high ground. The languages are different. The cultures developed independently. The distances are vast, thousands of miles separating the Ojibwe Great Lakes region from the Hopi Desert, from Cherokee Mountains, from Pacific Northwest coast. These peoples didn't have written communication with each other. They didn't share religious texts. Many never met at all. Yet they all remembered. The water rising beyond anything normal, the world drowning, the survivors few, the animals saved, the land emerging again, the beginning from almost nothing. And here's what matters. These aren't recent inventions or stories influenced by European contact. Archaeological and anthropological evidence shows these traditions predate colonization. Recent studies increasingly validate details within indigenous oral histories, like Aboriginal Australian stories that accurately describe coastlines from 10,000 years ago, now proven through geological surveys. These traditions are sophisticated mnemonic systems, methods of preserving knowledge across generations without writing. The stories aren't just entertainment. They're living archives, historical records maintained through repetition and ceremony, protected as sacred because the information they contain is too important to lose. From Arctic to Southwest, from Pacific to Atlantic, separated by vast distances and different languages, indigenous nations across North America all remembered the water rising. They all told their children. They all preserved the warning. They all remembered because something happened, something real enough and terrible enough that the memory couldn't be allowed to fade. And that memory survived, passed down through hundreds of generations, reaching us today. But the Americas are one landmass, connected by migration routes over millennia. Perhaps these stories spread person to person across generations, carried by ancient travelers moving north to south and east to west. Perhaps that explains the similarities. But what about civilizations across oceans, separated by waters no ancient boat could cross? They remembered too. A tiny fish asked for mercy. In return, it saved the world from drowning. The story begins with the sage Manu washing his hands in a river. This was morning ritual, simple and repeated, nothing remarkable. But on this particular morning, a small fish approached him in the shallow water, and the fish spoke. "Protect me," it said. "Keep me safe from the larger fish that would devour me. And one day, I will save you from a great catastrophe." Manu, being wise and compassionate, agreed. He placed the tiny fish in a jar of water. But the fish grew. Within a day, it was too large for the jar. Manu moved it to a larger vessel. The fish grew again. He moved it to a pond. Still, it grew. He moved it to a lake. The fish continued expanding. Finally, Manu carried it to the ocean and released it there. And the fish, now enormous, revealed its true nature. This was Matsya, an avatar of Vishnu, the preserver god who takes different forms to save creation when it's threatened. And the threat was coming. Soon. In 7 days, Matsya told him, a great flood will come. Not a normal rain or river overflow. Something catastrophic. Waters that will cover the earth, drowning all life, erasing everything. You must prepare. Build a boat. Make it strong. Gather seeds of every plant. Bring pairs of every animal. Invite 7 sages, the wisest teachers, the keepers of knowledge. Everything must be preserved, or it will be lost forever. Manu obeyed. For 7 days, he worked without rest. The boat took shape. The animals came. The sages gathered, bringing with them the Vedas, the sacred texts, the accumulated wisdom of humanity. Seeds were collected and stored. Provisions were loaded. When everything was ready, when the last sage stepped aboard, the rains began. The deluge was unlike anything in human experience. Water fell from the sky and rose from the earth simultaneously. Rivers broke their banks. Seas overflowed their shores. The land disappeared beneath the rising waters. Mountains vanished. Valleys filled. Everything drowned. The boat tossed on endless waters, directionless, lost in an ocean that covered the world. There was no land anywhere, no reference point, no way to navigate. And the storms continued, waves threatening to capsize them, winds tearing at the vessel. Then Matsya appeared, not as a small fish in a river, but as a being of unimaginable size, horned like no creature that had ever existed. The horn rose from the water, and Manu understood. He tied the boat's rope to that horn, and Matsya began to swim, towing them through the chaos, pulling them towards safety. The journey took days, maybe weeks. The text doesn't specify. But eventually, through the endless waters and eternal storms, a peak emerged. The highest point in the Himalayas, rising above the flood. Matsya brought them to that mountain and released them there. The waters began to recede, slowly at first, then faster. The world emerged again, drowned and empty, but ready for life. Manu and the 7 sages disembarked. They released the animals. They planted the seeds. And from them, humanity began again. Every person alive today, the texts say, descends from Manu. We are all children of the flood survivor. This story appears in the Satapatha Brahmana, dated to around 1000 BCE, but scholars believe it preserves much older oral traditions. And notice what it contains. Divine warning. Boat construction with specific instructions. Animals and seeds preserved. 7 wise keepers of knowledge. Waters covering the earth. Landing on a mountain. Beginning again from a remnant. The structure matches Mesopotamian accounts perfectly. Though India and Mesopotamia were separated by mountains, deserts, and vast distances, the theological framework is different. Hindu gods, Hindu cosmology, but the underlying narrative is the same. They never met. They never traded. Yet somehow, they were telling the same story about the same catastrophe. India wasn't alone in Asia. To the east, Chinese civilization preserved flood memories so detailed they included the names of the engineers who fought the waters. For 13 years, he dug channels, dredged rivers, moved mountains of earth. He didn't survive the flood. He fought it back. The Chinese tell this not as mythology, but as history. During the reign of the legendary Emperor Yao, around 2200 BCE, according to traditional chronology, catastrophic flooding began. This wasn't a brief disaster. This was generations of water rising from earth and falling from sky, submerging mountains and plains, drowning cities and fields, creating an inland sea that covered what should have been land. The emperor called for Gun, a figure described as semi-divine, to stop the flooding. Gun's approach was to build dams and levees, to block the water, to hold it back through brute force. He stole Shirang, magical self-expanding soil from heaven, and used it to construct barriers. For 9 years he worked, but the waters kept rising. The dams failed. The levees broke. The flooding worsened. The emperor, furious at the failure, ordered Gun executed. And from Gun's corpse, 3 years later, his son Yu was born. Not conceived, not raised, born directly from his father's dead body, inheriting the mission, taking up the task that had killed his father. But Yu approached the problem differently. Instead of blocking the water, he would channel it. Instead of fighting the flood, he would guide it. For 13 years, he dredged rivers, carved new channels, organized drainage systems, mobilized workers across the entire region. He mapped the waterways. He understood the landscape. He worked systematically, transforming not just the rivers but the entire relationship between land and water. The Chinese texts describe his dedication in remarkable detail. He passed his own house 3 times during those 13 years, but never went inside. His wife had just given birth, and he heard his son crying as he walked by. But he didn't stop. The work was too urgent. Thousands depended on him. If he failed, more would drown. But he didn't fail. After 13 years, the waters were controlled. The flooding stopped. The land dried. Crops could grow again. Cities could be rebuilt. Emperor Yao was so impressed, he passed over his own son and named Yu as his successor. Yu became emperor and founded the Xia dynasty, the first dynasty of China, the transition point from prehistoric to historic civilization. Chinese scholars have always treated this as real history, not metaphor. The Shujing, the Book of Documents, describes Yu's work as engineering fact. The Shiji, written by Sima Qian around 100 BCE, presents Gun and Yu as historical figures whose actions shaped China's geography and political structure. This was the event that divided time, before the flood and after the flood. And recent archaeology has validated aspects of the story. In 2016, researchers discovered evidence of a massive flood in the Yellow River Valley around 1920 BCE. An earthquake triggered a landslide that dammed the river, creating a huge lake. When the natural dam broke, it released a catastrophic flood that would have matched the descriptions in Chinese texts. The dating is slightly later than traditional chronology places Yu, but it confirms that massive, civilization-threatening flooding did occur in ancient China during the period these stories describe. What makes the Chinese tradition fascinating is its difference from other flood myths. Most cultures describe passive survival: build a boat, float, wait for waters to recede, then begin again. Chinese tradition describes active resistance: fight the water, channel it, control it, transform the landscape to prevent future catastrophe. Human engineering, defeating natural disaster. Yet both traditions preserve the same core memory: catastrophic flooding that nearly destroyed civilization, that divided time into before and after, that required extraordinary effort to survive. Chinese civilization developed independently, with no contact with Mesopotamia or the Americas. Yet their earliest history, like everyone else's, was structured around a great flood. But Asia extends beyond the continent. In the Pacific, on islands scattered across impossible distances, people who navigated by stars also remembered when the water rose. They were surrounded by ocean, lived their entire lives on water, yet they all feared it, because they remembered when it rose and swallowed the land. In Hawaii, they tell of Nu, warned by a god of coming destruction. He built a large canoe, loaded it with animals and plants and his family. The flood came. Waters covered everything. When it finally receded, Nu's canoe came to rest on Mauna Kea, the highest peak. He disembarked and made offerings. But in his confusion, he offered them to the moon instead of the creator god. A god appeared and corrected him, explaining that the moon was not worthy of such worship. Nu adjusted his prayers, and life began again. Move west to Fiji. The stories here speak of two gods, Ndungai or Turukawa, sending floods to punish humanity. Survivors escaped by building rafts or taking refuge in mountain caves that stayed above the rising waters. The flood covered the lowlands, drowned the villages, erased the coastal settlements. When the waters fell, the survivors descended and rebuilt. In Tahiti, in Samoa, across Polynesia, variations of the same story repeat. Waters rising beyond normal bounds, land that was always above water, disappearing beneath the sea. Catastrophic destruction. Few survivors. Beginning again from remnant populations. What's remarkable here is the context. These are ocean cultures. They lived on islands surrounded by water. They navigated by stars across vast distances. They understood seas and tides better than almost anyone. Yet their most sacred stories, the narratives they preserved through generations, were about catastrophic flooding, not normal storms or tsunamis. Those were common enough to be unremarkable. These stories described something different, something that changed the world. And here's the crucial detail that appears across Pacific traditions. Many of them describe lands that sank. Not just flooding, but entire territories disappearing beneath the waves. Islands that vanished. Continents that were swallowed. Western scholars in the 19th and early 20th centuries proposed Mu or Lemuria, lost Pacific continents that supposedly sank in catastrophe. These theories have been largely discredited as geology revealed how ocean basins actually form. But the oral traditions that inspired these theories remain. Why would isolated island populations, separated by thousands of miles of ocean, all tell stories about sinking lands? Perhaps because lands actually did sink, not lost continents, but something just as dramatic. During the last ice age, sea levels were nearly 400 feet lower than today. What we call shallow waters around Pacific islands were actually land then. Islands were bigger. Some were connected. Coastlines extended far beyond where they are now. When the ice age ended and sea levels rose, these lands disappeared. Not overnight, but over centuries and millennia. Fast enough to be remembered. Slow enough that generations watched the water advance, saw familiar territories vanish. witnessed islands becoming smaller, watched coastlines retreat. Look at Doggerland in the North Sea, a vast plain connecting Britain to Europe, now completely underwater. Or Sunderland in Southeast Asia, a landmass the size of India connecting Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, now submerged. These aren't theories, they're archaeological facts. These lands existed. People lived there. And when sea levels rose, they drowned. The Pacific oral traditions might be preserving exactly this. Memories of real lands that really sank as seas rose over thousands of years. Not catastrophic overnight flooding, but relentless rise that swallowed territories that had been home for countless generations. From Hawaii to New Zealand, spanning distances that would take weeks to sail, even with sophisticated navigation. Isolated island populations all told their children about catastrophic floods and drowned lands. They couldn't have borrowed these stories from each other. The distances were too vast, the isolation too complete. Yet the narratives align. They all remembered. The ocean peoples who understood water better than anyone remembered when it rose beyond all normal bounds, when it covered lands that should have been safe, when it swallowed territories and forced survivors to flee to higher ground. And from the Himalayas to the Pacific Islands, civilizations separated by mountains, oceans, and millennia all preserved the same memory. But we haven't yet examined the most famous flood story of all, one that shaped Western civilization and remains embedded in our culture. God regretted creating humanity. All of it. Everything had to drown, except one family. The book of Genesis, chapters 6 through 9, tells the story that would shape Western civilization's understanding of catastrophic flooding for the next 3,000 years. And it begins not with water, but with grief. God looked at the earth and saw that human wickedness had become complete. Every thought, every intention, every action was bent toward violence and corruption. And God regretted. The text uses that specific word, regret. The Creator grieved over creation, felt pain at what humanity had become. The decision was made. Everything would be destroyed. All flesh would be wiped from the earth. The experiment would end, except for one man. Noah was righteous, the text says, blameless in his generation. God came to him with a warning and a command. Build an ark. Not a small boat, but a massive vessel. 300 cubits long, roughly 450 feet, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high, 3 decks. A single door in the side. A window at the top for light and air. Cover it inside and out with pitch to make it waterproof. The instructions were precise. Bring animals. 7 pairs of every clean animal. 1 pair of every unclean. Bring birds. 7 pairs of each kind. Load food for everyone, enough to last months. Gather your family, your wife, your 3 sons, their wives. When everything is aboard, seal the door and wait. Noah obeyed. For years, he built. His neighbors must have thought him mad. Why would anyone build a ship on dry land? far from any sea. But Noah continued working, following instructions that made no sense in a world that had never seen rain like what was coming. When the ark was finished, the animals came. The text describes them walking to the ark on their own, drawn by some instinct or divine guidance. Pairs entering, filling the vessel with life. Noah's family boarded last. The door was sealed, and they waited 7 days. Then the flood began. But this wasn't just rain. Genesis describes it with terrible poetry. All the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of heaven were opened. Water came from above and below simultaneously. The earth itself was breaking, releasing waters that had been held back since creation. The sky was pouring out everything it contained. For 40 days and 40 nights, the rain fell. The waters rose higher and higher. 15 cubits above the highest mountains, the text says. Everything drowned. Every person not on the ark, every land animal, every bird. The earth became an ocean with no shore, no land, no refuge anywhere. The ark floated on waters that covered the world. For 150 days, those waters prevailed. A specific number, carefully counted. Then they began to recede. The ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The waters continued falling. Noah waited. After 40 days, he opened the window and sent out a raven. It flew back and forth, finding no place to land. Then he sent a dove. It returned. He waited 7 days and sent the dove again. It came back with an olive leaf in its beak, proof that plants were growing again, that land existed. 7 more days. The dove flew out and didn't return. Noah removed the covering and looked out at a world washed clean, empty, waiting. God told him to disembark, to release the animals, to begin again. Noah built an altar on the mountain and offered sacrifices. God smelled the pleasing aroma and made a covenant. Never again would flood destroy all life. Never again would the earth be drowned. The rainbow would be the sign of this promise, appearing in the sky whenever rain fell, reminding both God and humanity of what had happened and what was promised. Scholars date the composition of Genesis to around the 6th or 5th century BCE, though it clearly incorporates much older oral traditions. The parallels with earlier Mesopotamian accounts are undeniable. The divine decision, the boat, the animals, the birds, the mountain, the sacrifice. But the framework is different. One God instead of many. Moral judgment instead of divine noise complaints. Covenant and promise instead of just survival. Regardless of religious belief, this narrative became foundational. For 3,000 years, Western culture understood catastrophic flooding through this story. The Noah story became dominant in the West, but Europe had other flood memories. Older, stranger, coming from peoples who never read Genesis. Zeus looked down at humanity and felt only disgust. The water would wash them away, all of them. The Greeks told their own flood story, independent of Hebrew tradition, preserved in texts from Ovid's Metamorphoses and earlier sources. And like Genesis, it began with divine judgment on human wickedness. The Bronze Age of humanity had grown corrupt. People were violent, impious, arrogant. They didn't honor the gods. They didn't respect sacred laws. King Lycaon of Arcadia was the final insult. He tried to trick Zeus by serving him human flesh disguised as animal meat, testing whether the god could tell the difference. Zeus saw through the deception instantly. His rage was absolute. If this is what humanity has become, Zeus declared, then humanity must be destroyed. He gathered the gods in council. They agreed. Flood would be the method. Zeus released the south wind to bring rain clouds. He commanded Poseidon to let the seas rise and rivers overflow. The waters came from every direction, rain from above, seas from below, rivers breaking their banks, springs bursting from the earth. The flood covered everything. Mountains disappeared beneath the rising waters. Cities drowned. Fields became ocean. People climbed trees, but the waters rose higher. They fled to hills, but the waters followed. Some tried to use boats, but the storms capsized them. One by one, all of humanity died, except for two people. Deucalion, son of Prometheus, had been warned by his father. Prometheus knew what was coming. He had the gift of foresight. He told Deucalion to build a wooden chest, essentially a boat, and stock it with provisions. When the flood came, Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha sealed themselves inside. For 9 days and 9 nights, the chest floated on endless waters. Finally, it came to rest on Mount Parnassus, the highest peak in Greece, the only point still above the flood. The waters began to recede. Deucalion and Pyrrha emerged into an empty world. They were alone, the last humans. Everyone else had drowned, and they were old. Too old to have children. Too old to repopulate the earth through natural means. The human race had ended, unless the gods intervened. Deucalion and Pyrrha walked down the mountain to the temple of Themis, goddess of divine order. They prayed for guidance. An oracle spoke to them cryptically. Depart from the temple with veiled heads and loosened robes, and throw behind you the bones of your mother. The bones of their mother. It made no sense. It sounded like sacrilege. Deucalion and Pyrrha stood confused and troubled. But then Deucalion understood. Their mother wasn't a person. It was Earth herself. Gaia. The ground beneath their feet. And her bones were stones. They covered their heads, loosened their robes, and walked forward, throwing stones over their shoulders without looking back. The stones Deucalion threw became men. The stones Pyrrha threw became women. New humans, born from the earth itself, forming from rock and soil. Humanity was reborn. The world could be repopulated. Life would continue. Notice the structure. Divine judgment on wicked humanity. A single righteous couple warned and preserved. A vessel that saves them. Waters covering the mountains. Landing on a peak after the flood. Beginning humanity again from survivors. The same narrative pattern we've seen in Mesopotamia, India, China, and the Americas. And here's what matters. Greek scholars discussed whether this was history or metaphor. Aristotle wrote about periodic floods that destroyed civilizations. Plato, in his Timaeus, describes Egyptian priests telling Solon about catastrophes that repeatedly wipe out human populations, leaving only mountain dwellers to survive while coastal civilizations drown. The Greeks themselves believed their myths contained historical memories, distorted by time but rooted in real events. Greek civilization, foundational to Western philosophy and science, preserved flood memories completely independent of Jewish tradition. They never borrowed from Genesis. They developed their flood narrative separately. Yet the story matches. Different gods, different theology, different cultural context, but the same catastrophe remembered. Zeus looked down at humanity and destroyed them with water. Only 2 survived to tell what happened. And from them, we all descend. But Europe's flood memories extended beyond the Mediterranean. In the frozen north, Norse tradition preserved a different kind of drowning. Not of the past, but of the future. In the frozen north, they prophesied the end. The serpent would rise from the sea, the waters would cover the world, and everything would drown before being born again. Norse mythology contains not 1 but 2 flood narratives. The first happened at the beginning of time, in the primordial past. Ymir, the frost giant, was the first being. When the gods killed him to create the world, his blood poured out in such quantities that it flooded everything. All the giants drowned in Ymir's blood, except for Bergelmir and his wife, who survived in a luda, variously translated as boat, coffin, or wooden chest. They floated on the blood water until it receded, then became the ancestors of a new generation of giants. That's the past. But the Norse also spoke of flooding in the future. Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, the end of everything. The prophecy was detailed and terrifying. The signs would be unmistakable. 3 winters without summer. War spreading across the world. Brothers killing brothers. All bonds breaking. Then the monsters would break free. Jörmungandr, the world serpent who encircles the earth in the ocean depths, would rise. His movement would cause the seas to surge onto the land. Waves would cover mountains. The ocean itself would invade, drowning the world, while Jörmungandr writhed in his death throes fighting Thor. Fire would join water. The fire giant Surtur would come from the south with his flaming sword, setting the world ablaze. Everything would burn and drown simultaneously. The same combination of fire and water that appears in so many flood myths, suggesting catastrophic events involving both elements. The gods would die. Odin, Thor, Freya, all would fall in battle against monsters and giants. The sun would be swallowed. The stars would disappear. The earth would sink beneath the waves. Everything would end, but not forever. The Norse believed in cyclical time. After Ragnarok, after the drowning, the earth would rise again from the sea, green and fertile. A new sun would shine. Two humans who survived by hiding in a sacred grove would emerge to repopulate the world. Some gods would return from death. Life would begin again. Destruction and renewal. Flood and rebirth. The pattern repeating endlessly through cosmic cycles. The world had ended before. The world would end again. Water was both destroyer and cleanser, wiping away corruption so creation could start fresh. The Norse texts weren't written down until the 13th century, centuries after Christianization, but they preserve pre-Christian oral traditions from Scandinavia. And those traditions, developed in complete isolation from Mediterranean cultures, contained flood memories, not imported, not borrowed, indigenous to the north. Move west to Celtic lands. Ireland and Wales preserve their own flood traditions. The Irish Lebor Gabala Iren describes multiple invasions of Ireland, with floods between them destroying previous inhabitants. Welsh tradition speaks of floods that drowned kingdoms, with only a few escaping to higher ground. From Scandinavia to Greece, from Ireland to the Mediterranean, European peoples who developed distinct cultures, different languages, separate religious systems, all maintained flood traditions. And these traditions predate Christianity's arrival in Europe. They're not borrowed from the Bible. They're indigenous memories, suggesting something deeper. Perhaps these memories were inherited from a common ancestral population, people who lived through catastrophic flooding, so traumatic that every culture they split into preserved the story. Perhaps these memories reach back to when sea levels rose and drowned the European coastlines, when Doggerland sank, when the Black Sea flooded, when the Mediterranean broke through at Gibraltar. We've now surveyed Mesopotamia, the Americas, Asia, the Pacific, and Europe. Every inhabited continent, hundreds of cultures, different languages, different gods, different worldviews, yet all remembering water that covered the world. This cannot be coincidence. The statistical probability is too small. This cannot be shared psychology. The details are too specific. So we have to ask, what does the earth itself remember? What do the rocks and ice and sediment tell us about what actually happened? The rocks don't lie. The ice doesn't forget. And they're both telling us the same thing. The water rose. Fast. We've spent hours tracing flood stories across continents, through cultures that never met, finding the same narrative preserved in different languages and different mythologies. But stories can be distorted. Memories can fail. Oral traditions, however carefully maintained, can shift over time. If we want to know what actually happened, we need to ask witnesses that can't forget, that can't embellish, that preserve the truth in ways no human memory can. We need to ask the earth itself. Sediment doesn't lie about its age. Ice cores don't invent their chemistry. Rock formations don't exaggerate erosion patterns. The physical world preserves history with perfect accuracy, layer by layer, year by year, recording everything that happened even when no one was there to witness it. Scientists read these records the way archaeologists read ancient texts. Sediment layers show what happened year by year, each thin band representing a season, a flood, a drought, a period of calm. Ice cores trap ancient atmosphere in tiny bubbles, preserving the exact composition of air from thousands of years ago, revealing temperature and climate conditions with precision that no human record could match. Erosion patterns tell us where water moved and how fast. Fossil deposits show what lived and when it died. And when scientists examine these records, looking specifically at the period around 12,000 years ago, they find something remarkable. The Earth remembers catastrophe. The boundary is called the Pleistocene-Holocene transition, marking the end of the last ice age, roughly 11,700 years ago. That date should sound familiar. It falls within the time frame that many flood myths describe. And the transition wasn't gentle. It wasn't gradual. The geological record shows rapid, dramatic, sometimes violent environmental change. During the Ice Age, vast glaciers covered much of the northern hemisphere. Ice sheets miles thick blanketed Canada, Scandinavia, parts of Asia. Sea levels were nearly 400 feet lower than today because so much water was locked up in ice. But when the Ice Age ended, all that ice had to go somewhere. It melted, and the water went into the oceans. But it didn't melt gradually over 10,000 years in a smooth curve. It melted in pulses. Sudden, catastrophic collapses of ice sheets, releasing massive amounts of water into the oceans in periods measured in decades, not millennia. Meltwater Pulse 1A occurred around 14,000 years ago. Sea levels rose between 10 and 25 meters. That's 30 to 80 feet in less than a century. Some estimates suggest it could have happened in as little as a few decades. For coastal populations, this wouldn't be gradual adjustment. This would be catastrophic flooding within a single human lifetime, possibly within a single generation. Then came Meltwater Pulse 1B, around 11,500 years ago. Another rapid rise. Another pulse of water flooding coastlines worldwide. Another generation watching the sea advance, swallowing territories that had been inhabited for thousands of years. Think about what this means. Archaeological evidence and modern demographics both suggest that roughly half of all human populations live on or near coasts. The resources are there. Fish, shellfish, sea mammals, seabirds, river mouths bringing nutrients from inland. Transportation is easier. Trade is possible. Coasts are where civilizations develop. If this pattern held in prehistory, and there's every reason to believe it did, then the most populated, likely the most advanced human settlements would have been on coastal plains. And when sea levels rose in pulses, when the water advanced 30, 50, 80 feet within decades, those coastal civilizations would have been destroyed. The flooding would have been catastrophic. Within a human lifetime, Familiar territories would disappear, settlements would drown, people would flee inland and upward, becoming refugees in lands already inhabited. Trade networks would collapse. Specialized knowledge would be lost as the people who held it drowned or were forced to focus entirely on survival. And here's what makes this particularly striking. These geological events, these meltwater pulses, these rapid sea level rises, coincide eerily with traditional dating of the flood in many ancient chronologies. The numbers align, the time frame matches. When the myths say the world flooded, the geology says the water rose. But rising water alone doesn't explain the stories. They describe more than just flooding. They describe sudden, violent catastrophe, fire and water together, darkness covering the sky. So what could cause that? Something hit the earth 12,900 years ago. The sky burned. The ice melted. The world ended in fire and water simultaneously. The Younger Dryas period is one of the most puzzling events in recent geological history. Picture this. The Ice Age is ending. Temperatures are rising steadily. Ice sheets are melting. The climate is warming. Everything is moving in one direction, toward the warm, stable conditions we live in today. Then suddenly, around 12,900 years ago, it reverses. Temperatures plummet. Ice cores from Greenland show the drop happened in less than a decade, possibly as fast as 3 years. 15 degrees Celsius. That's 27 degrees Fahrenheit. In less than 10 years, the world returned to Ice Age conditions. The cold held for 1,200 years. Then, just as suddenly, it ended. Temperatures shot back up around 11,700 years ago, rising even faster than they'd fallen. The Ice Age ended for real this time. The Holocene, our current geological period, began. But what caused it? Why would warming suddenly reverse? Why would the Earth plunge back into Ice Age conditions for over 1,000 years, then abruptly warm again? For decades, scientists proposed various mechanisms: changes in ocean currents, variations in solar output, volcanic activity, but none fully explained the evidence. Then, starting in the 1980s, researchers began finding something strange in the geological record. A layer of sediment, dark and carbon-rich, appears at sites across North America and in parts of Europe, dating to exactly 12,900 years ago. Scientists call it the black mat, and it contains things that shouldn't be there. Platinum concentrations far higher than normal. Nanodiamonds. Microscopic diamonds that form under extreme heat and pressure. Magnetic spherules. Tiny balls of melted rock, indicating temperatures hot enough to vaporize stone. Carbon spherules from massive wildfires. Shocked quartz showing evidence of intense impact forces. These are the signatures of cosmic impact. Something from space struck the Earth. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that fragments of a comet hit North America around 12,900 years ago. Not a single impact, but multiple fragments. A shotgun blast from space hitting ice sheets, oceans, and land across the northern hemisphere. The evidence keeps accumulating. The black mat layer isn't limited to one site. It appears across thousands of miles, suggesting continent-scale catastrophe. Analysis of the nanodiamonds confirms they formed at temperatures and pressures consistent with impact events. The platinum anomaly matches patterns seen at other known impact boundaries in Earth's geological history. And here's what makes it particularly relevant. The timing coincides exactly with multiple catastrophic events, all happening simultaneously. First, massive wildfires. Charcoal and carbon deposits show that fires burned across enormous areas at the same time. Forests in North America, Europe, and possibly other continents, all igniting within the same period. The black mat is essentially a layer of ash and burned material covering vast territories. Second, the extinction of North American megafauna. Mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, dire wolves, short-faced bears. Over 35 genera of large mammals disappeared at the Younger Dryas boundary. Not gradually, suddenly. Their bones appear in the archaeological record right up to that black mat layer, then stop. Third, the disappearance of the Clovis culture. The most widespread and sophisticated human culture in North America at the time simply vanishes from the record at 12,900 years ago. Their distinctive stone tools stop appearing. Their settlements are abandoned. Whatever happened didn't just kill the animals. It devastated human populations too. Fourth, and most importantly for our story, rapid climate change and sea level rise. If comet fragments struck the ice sheets covering Canada and Scandinavia, the impacts would have caused catastrophic melting. Billions of tons of ice would have liquefied in days or weeks, not centuries. That water had to go somewhere. It went into the oceans, rapidly, catastrophically, creating exactly the kind of sudden, devastating flooding that flood myths describe. The impact would also explain the fire and darkness that appear in so many flood narratives. Impacts would ignite widespread fires. Debris thrown into the atmosphere would darken the sky for months, possibly years. Survivors would have experienced exactly what the myths describe: the sky burning, darkness falling, water rising, everything destroyed simultaneously. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis remains controversial. Not all scientists accept it, but peer-reviewed publications continue documenting evidence. The debate is legitimate scientific discourse, not fringe speculation, and the time frame is crucial. 12,900 years ago falls within the range that oral traditions could preserve. Aboriginal Australians maintain accurate stories for over 10,000 years. Something catastrophic happened 12,800 years ago. The Earth remembers it in layers of sediment, in ice cores, in the sudden disappearance of species, in the charcoal of continental fires. And humans remembered it too, in stories passed down through hundreds of generations. But impact and rapid sea level rise still don't explain everything. The flood myths don't just describe water. They describe losing entire worlds, advanced societies drowned and forgotten. So we have to ask, what drowned? What was lost beneath the rising seas? Everything we know about ancient humans comes from what survived above water. But the most advanced civilizations would have been on the coast. And the coast is gone. All of it. 400 feet underwater. During the last glacial maximum, 20,000 years ago, the world looked completely different. Not just colder, but geographically transformed. Sea levels were 120 meters lower than today, nearly 400 feet. That's a 40-story building, measuring the difference between Ice Age coast and modern coast. What we call shallow waters today were dry land then. The continental shelves, those gently sloping underwater plains extending from modern coastlines, were above water. Inhabitable. And certainly inhabited. Look at Doggerland. It connected Britain to continental Europe, a vast plain stretching across what's now the North Sea. Rivers flowed through it. Forests grew. Animals grazed. Archaeological evidence shows humans lived there. Their tools, their settlements. Evidence of their lives occasionally dredged up by fishing boats or discovered through underwater surveys. But Doggerland drowned as sea levels rose, and now it's gone. A lost territory the size of England, or Sunderland in Southeast Asia. During the Ice Age, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines were connected as a single landmass the size of India. The South China Sea was land. The Java Sea was land. What are now thousands of separate islands were one continent. People lived there. They built settlements, developed cultures, created trade networks. When sea levels rose, Sunderland drowned. Only the mountains remain, poking above the water as scattered islands. The Persian Gulf was a fertile river valley, not a sea. The Mediterranean coastlines extended miles beyond where they are now. The Bering Land Bridge connected Asia to North America. The Black Sea was smaller, and possibly much smaller. Some geologists propose it was a freshwater lake that catastrophically flooded when the Mediterranean broke through around 5600 BCE, though that date is much more recent than the events we're discussing. Millions of square kilometers of land, inhabited, utilized, certainly explored by humans, now underwater. And here's the crucial observation. Humans didn't live randomly distributed across landscapes. We concentrated on coasts and river mouths. Why? Because that's where the resources are. Coasts provide multiple food sources. Ocean fish, shellfish, seabirds, sea mammals. Rivers bring nutrients from inland, creating fertile zones where terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems meet. Transportation is easier on water than through forests or across mountains. Trade becomes possible. Population density increases. Complexity develops. Specialization becomes viable when food security is high enough that not everyone needs to be gathering or hunting. Archaeological evidence confirms this pattern. Ancient shell middens, massive piles of discarded shells from thousands of years of shellfish consumption. Mark coastal settlements. The oldest permanent settlements we've found are often near water. Modern demographics show the same pattern. Roughly half of all humans live within 100 kilometers of a coast. If this pattern held in prehistory, and there's every reason to believe it did, then the most populated settlements during the Ice Age would have been on coastal plains. Not on the mountains where we find evidence today, but on the shores, 400 feet below current sea level. When sea levels rose 120 meters over several thousand years, not gradually and smoothly, but episodically, in pulses, with sudden catastrophic rises during meltwater events, those coastal settlements would have been progressively flooded. The most advanced civilizations, the highest population centers, the places where specialized knowledge accumulated, would have been the first to drown. And they're simply gone now, buried under hundreds of feet of ocean water and thousands of years of sediment accumulation. Less than 5% of the ocean floor has been surveyed. Underwater archaeology at the depths we're discussing is prohibitively expensive and technologically challenging. We have barely looked. But occasionally, hints emerge. The Yonaguni Monument off Japan, underwater stone formations with right angles and apparent terracing that some researchers argue are artificial, though this remains controversial. Dwarka off the coast of India, sonar mapping showing walls and foundations beneath 100 feet of water. Submerged settlements in the Mediterranean, predating classical civilizations by thousands of years. These might be just the beginning, the most accessible hints of what lies deeper. Our picture of human prehistory is fundamentally biased. We find what survived above water: inland settlements, upland populations, mountain caves, highland sites. These were often smaller, less complex, less advanced than coastal civilizations would have been, but coastal evidence drowned. It's not conspiracy. It's not suppressed knowledge. It's simple geography. The most interesting archaeological sites from human prehistory are inaccessible, buried beneath oceans, beyond our current ability to explore systematically. So this is how flood myths could be real. This is what they could be remembering. Catastrophic sea level rise during the Younger Dryas and afterward, destroying coastal civilizations, forcing survivors inland and upward, drowning the territories where the most advanced populations lived. But why do they remember? How did the memory survive when the civilizations didn't? The most advanced didn't survive. The most knowledgeable drowned. Survival wasn't about wisdom. It was about elevation. The flood myths tell us something uncomfortable if we pay attention. The survivors are never the kings. They're never the high priests, with their accumulated knowledge and sacred texts. They're never the master architects who built the monuments, or the astronomers who mapped the stars. The survivors are always ordinary families who happened to be in the right place when catastrophe struck. Noah wasn't chosen because he was the wisest man alive. He was called righteous, yes, but righteousness might mean something simpler than we think. He was inland. He was away from the coast. When the waters rose, he had time to build. Utnapishtim, in the Mesopotamian version, lived in a reed house far enough from the ocean that he could prepare. Manu, in the Hindu tradition, received warning and had elevation to reach. Deucalion landed on Mount Parnassus because mountains were the only refuge. The pattern repeats across every culture. Survivors took refuge on high ground, not because they were special, but because they were geographically fortunate. Here's the brutal logic of catastrophic flooding. Coastal civilizations would have been the most advanced. The coast is where resources concentrate. Seafood, trade routes, transportation networks. Population density is higher. Specialization becomes possible. You get architects, astronomers, mathematicians, priests, scribes, craftspeople with specialized knowledge. Complexity develops. Sophistication accumulates over generations. But when sea levels rise catastrophically, the coast is exactly where you don't want to be. The sophisticated coastal cities with their accumulated wisdom, their libraries and temples and workshops, their specialists and experts, all of it was in the path of rising water. The people who knew how to build monuments, how to track astronomical cycles, how to preserve and transmit complex knowledge. They drowned. Their cities flooded. Their infrastructure collapsed. Their texts, if they existed, were destroyed. Meanwhile, upland populations, smaller groups, simpler societies, people living in mountains and highlands, survived simply because they were already at elevation. They didn't need warning. They didn't need to flee. The water never reached them. Catastrophe doesn't preserve the most advanced. It preserves the most geographically fortunate. It's a filter, and it filters based on location, not merit. The genetic evidence supports this. Analysis of human DNA suggests our population crashed to perhaps 10,000 individuals at some point in our recent past. 10,000 people. That's not a flourishing civilization with multiple sophisticated cultures. That's a bottleneck. That's near extinction. That's exactly what you'd expect from catastrophic flooding that destroyed coastal populations worldwide. Imagine what this would have felt like. Communities fragmenting as people fled inland. Trade networks collapsing because the coastal cities that connected them were drowning. Specialists dying with their knowledge untransmitted. The astronomer who tracked eclipses, gone. The architect who understood load-bearing calculations, drowned. The scribe who maintained historical records, disappeared. The infrastructure abandoned. The monuments left behind. The knowledge lost because there was no one left to teach it to. Survival mode erases sophistication. When every day is about finding food and water, when you're living in a cave or a crude shelter because your city is underwater, when you're surrounded by refugees all competing for limited resources in lands that were already inhabited, passing on abstract knowledge becomes impossible. You teach your children how to hunt, how to find water, how to avoid predators. You don't teach them astronomy or architecture, or the historical chronicles of kings who ruled before the flood. The flood myths themselves preserve this reality. They never say the wisest survived, or the most knowledgeable preserved their learning. They say one family survived, or a few escaped to the mountains, or the righteous were saved. And righteous might not mean morally pure. It might mean lucky. It might mean inland. It might mean alive. The most advanced civilizations drowned. The survivors were ordinary people who happened to be at elevation, and from them, from that bottleneck, from that near extinction event, humanity had to rebuild everything. But some survivors did preserve knowledge. They passed down the stories of what happened. So how? How do memories survive centuries without writing? They had no writing. but they remembered for 10,000 years. They remembered the coastlines that drowned. They remembered the stars. They remembered the flood. Western culture has a bias. We trust writing. We trust documents. We assume that without written records, information degrades, stories change, accuracy is impossible. Oral tradition is dismissed as unreliable, prone to embellishment, more mythology than history. But that bias is wrong, and we can prove it. Aboriginal Australians maintain the longest continuous oral tradition on Earth. Stories passed down through their cultures describe specific coastal locations, specific islands, specific landmarks that are now underwater. They describe the time when you could walk to places that are now separated by ocean. They describe when Tasmania was connected to the mainland, when the coastline was different, when the geography was transformed. Geologists thought these were myths. Then they mapped the ocean floor and calculated sea level changes, and the stories matched perfectly. The locations the Aboriginal stories described really were above water, 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. The oral traditions were preserving accurate geography from the end of the Ice Age, transmitted across 400 generations without writing. The stories weren't distorted. They weren't embellished beyond recognition. They were accurate enough that modern science confirmed their details. 10,000 years of oral transmission, and the core information survived intact. Or look at Polynesian navigation. For thousands of years, Polynesians crossed vast stretches of Pacific Ocean without instruments, without compasses, without written charts. They navigated by stars, by wave patterns, by bird behavior, knowledge encoded in chants and stories, and passed down through generations. When Western scholars finally studied these traditions seriously, they discovered the information was precise, astronomically accurate, oceanographically sophisticated. The oral traditions preserved complex technical knowledge that worked. Jewish oral tradition maintained specific legal and cultural information for centuries before anything was written down. The Talmud began as oral teaching, memorized and transmitted with extreme care. Epic poetry traditions, the Iliad, the Mahabharata, show how vast amounts of information can be preserved through memorization and recitation. How do oral cultures do this? How do they maintain accuracy across centuries? Stories are memorable in ways that abstract facts are not. Narrative creates structure. Characters create emotional connection. Plot creates sequence. The human brain is optimized for remembering stories, not lists of data. If you want information to survive, you wrap it in narrative. Rhythm and poetry aid retention. Much oral tradition is chanted or sung because rhythm creates patterns that stick in memory. You've experienced this. You can remember song lyrics from decades ago, but not what you read last week. Music and rhythm are mnemonic devices. Sacred narratives receive community protection. When a story is considered religiously important, the entire culture becomes responsible for preserving it. Changes are blasphemous. Errors are dangerous. The community self-corrects, with elders checking younger people's recitation, ensuring accuracy across generations. and dramatic events encode better than mundane information. You remember where you were during major disasters. You remember the day that changed everything. Catastrophic flooding, watching the water rise, seeing cities drown, fleeing to mountains while everyone else dies. That creates memories so powerful they burn into cultural consciousness. Oral cultures develop specialists whose role is remembering. Memory keepers, historians, poets. These aren't entertainers. They're archivists. In cultures without writing, they are the libraries. Their training is rigorous. Their responsibility is sacred. They don't create stories. They preserve them. And accuracy matters in ways we don't appreciate. In oral cultures, changing sacred stories can be punishable by death. The stories are considered literally sacred. Connection to ancestors, to gods, to identity itself. You don't modify them. You don't improve them. You transmit them exactly as you receive them. Look at flood myths worldwide. Despite thousands of years of transmission, despite thousands of miles of separation, the structural consistency is remarkable. Divine warning. Boat construction. Animals preserved. Waters covering mountains. Landing on high ground. Beginning again. These elements repeat with precision that suggests careful preservation, not creative elaboration. Yes, theological frameworks differ. Different cultures wrap the core events in their own religious understanding. Gods send the flood in some versions. Natural forces cause it in others. But the underlying sequence remains consistent. The details stay intact. This is mythologization. Actual historical events becoming wrapped in theological framework as they're transmitted through generations. The mechanism changes from natural to divine. The explanation shifts from climate to punishment. But the core events, waters rose, people survived in boats, landed on mountains, began again, remain because they're treated as sacred truth. Oral tradition works. It's been proven. Aboriginal Australians remembered coastlines for 10,000 years. Polynesians remembered navigation for thousands. Jewish tradition remembered law and custom for centuries. And survivors of catastrophic flooding remembered the flood. They had no writing, but they remembered. Because the story was too important to forget. Because forgetting would mean losing connection to everyone who came before. Because the warning had to survive. But the stories don't just preserve facts. They preserve emotions. They preserve warnings. They preserve fear. The people who survived wanted their descendants to remember. Why? They didn't tell the story to entertain children. They told it because forgetting could kill everyone. The water rose once. It could rise again. Trauma creates memory. Not just personal trauma, but collective trauma, cultural trauma, the kind of catastrophic event that defines a civilization's entire understanding of itself. When something terrible enough happens, survivors feel compelled to share what they experienced, not just to process it emotionally, but to warn, to prepare, to make certain it never happens again, or that if it does, people will recognize it and know what to do. Never forget. We say this about the Holocaust, about genocides, about disasters and wars and catastrophes. It's not just about honoring the dead. though that matters. It's about prevention, about maintaining awareness that these things are possible, that they happened before, that they could happen again if we're not vigilant. Flood survivors would have felt the same imperative. They'd watched the world drown. They'd seen everyone they knew die. They'd witnessed the complete destruction of their civilization. That kind of trauma doesn't fade. It demands to be remembered. It insists on being transmitted. But beyond trauma, there's practical warning. If catastrophic flooding happened before, it could happen again. The stories function as cultural warning systems, maintaining awareness across generations that the water can rise, that the seas aren't stable, that what seems permanent can disappear beneath the waves. The myths aren't just history, they're prophecy. They're saying, this happened, so watch for the signs. If the waters start rising, don't wait. If the animals start behaving strangely, pay attention. If the weather becomes unusual, prepare. The warning is encoded in narrative form because narrative survives. Because stories are remembered when abstract warnings are forgotten. And there's identity. The flood becomes the defining event of the culture. Everything is measured against it. There's before the flood and after the flood. The Sumerian king list explicitly divides history this way. Kings who ruled before the flood swept over, and different kings who ruled after. Chinese chronology is structured around Yu's control of the waters. Biblical genealogy traces lineage through Noah. Hindu cosmology counts world ages by the catastrophes that ended them. Remembering the catastrophe connects present to past. It legitimizes current society as descendants of survivors, blessed or chosen or simply fortunate enough to continue. It provides continuity across the gap, bridging the break in civilization, maintaining link to ancestors, even though everything they built was destroyed. The stories also encode ethics. Noah was righteous, while others were wicked. Deucalion was pious, while others were impious. The wooden people in Mayan myth were destroyed because they were empty, soulless. The pattern repeats. Righteousness leads to survival. Wickedness leads to destruction. The flood becomes moral teaching, warning that behavior has consequences, that cosmic forces or divine judgment responds to human actions. This makes the memory serve social function. Parents tell children the flood story not just as history, but as ethics. Be righteous like Noah, or you'll drown with the wicked. Respect the gods like Deucalion, or you'll be destroyed like Lycaon. Remember your makers like proper humans, or you'll be unmade like the wooden people. The catastrophe becomes reinforcement for moral codes. All these functions, trauma, warning, identity, ethics, made flood stories sacred. They weren't optional. They weren't entertainment. They were essential cultural information that absolutely had to be transmitted accurately to every generation. Many flood myths include explicit instructions to remember. God tells Noah that this covenant is for all future generations. The rainbow is a sign not just for the survivors, but for their descendants, forever. Survivors are commanded to tell what happened, to make certain the memory survives. This is conscious preservation of historical memory. The survivors knew they were creating a record. They knew they were transmitting warning. They encoded the most important information. The waters rose. The world drowned. Only those at elevation survived. begin again, but remember what was lost in the most durable format they had. Sacred narrative, protected by religion, transmitted through ritual, repeated until every member of the culture knew it by heart. Compare this to modern Holocaust remembrance. Never forget isn't just about historical accuracy. It's about preventing recurrence. It's about honoring victims. It's about maintaining identity. It's about warning future generations that these horrors are possible, that humans are capable of this evil, that vigilance matters. Flood myths might function identically. Memory of actual catastrophe maintained across 10,000 years, because forgetting would dishonor everyone who drowned. Because forgetting would endanger descendants who need to know catastrophe is possible. Because forgetting would sever connection to ancestral identity, to the reality that we are survivors, that we descend from people who endured world-ending disaster. If flood myths are historical memory, they're also prophecy. What happened before could happen again. The water rose once. Under the right conditions, rapid climate change, ice sheet collapse, whatever mechanism triggered it before, the water could rise again. And the stories are trying to warn us. They preserve the memory because survival depended on it, because the information was too valuable to lose, because someone had to remember when the world nearly ended, so that if the signs appeared again, people would recognize them, would know to head for high ground, would know to prepare, would know, above all, that catastrophe is possible, that the world can drown, that nothing is permanent. So now we understand. The stories are real. Not literal in every detail, but real. Preserving memory of actual catastrophe. But what does this mean? What do we do with this understanding? We asked why every culture remembers the same catastrophe. Now we know. Because it happened. They remember because it was real. Let's trace back through what we've learned, because the pieces fit together in ways that should change how we see everything. We began with a pattern. Over 200 cultures across every inhabited continent, preserving flood myths with striking similarities. Not vague stories about heavy rain, but specific narratives with repeating elements. Divine warning or natural omen, catastrophic flooding that covered the world, survival of a few in boats or on mountains, animals and seeds deliberately preserved, humanity beginning again from near extinction. We explored those stories in detail. From Mesopotamia, where the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis epic described 7 days of storms, boats sealed with bitumen, birds sent to test for land, mountains emerging from endless waters, to the Americas, where Aztec world ages, and Mayan creation myths described drowning that ended entire epochs, where Ojibwe and Hopi and dozens of other nations remembered water rising beyond anything normal. To Asia, where Hindu texts described Matsya towing Manu's boat to Himalayan peaks, where Chinese history divided itself by the Great Flood Gun and Yu fought for 13 years. To the Pacific, where island peoples surrounded by ocean still feared the water because they remembered when it rose and swallowed lands. To Europe, where Noah's Ark became the dominant narrative, but Greek and Norse traditions preserved independent memories of catastrophic flooding. The pattern was undeniable. These cultures never met. They developed separately. They couldn't have borrowed these stories from each other. Yet the structural elements matched with precision that defied coincidence. Then we shifted from mythology to geology, and the earth confirmed what the stories claimed. The rocks and ice don't lie. They show catastrophic sea level rise during the exact period the myths describe. Meltwater pulse, 1A and 1B. Periods when sea levels rose tens of meters in decades or centuries. Not gradually, but catastrophically. The Younger Dryas period showing possible comet impacts, massive wildfires, sudden extinction of megafauna, the disappearance of human cultures, and rapid climate chaos. 400 feet of sea level difference between Ice Age and today, drowning millions of square kilometers of coastal plains where human populations would have concentrated. We examined who survived and how. Geography determined survival more than sophistication. Coastal civilizations drowned while mountain populations persisted, simply through luck of elevation. The genetic bottleneck suggesting human population crashed to perhaps 10,000 individuals, and we explored how oral tradition could preserve accurate information across 10,000 years. Aboriginal Australians proving it works. Polynesian navigation confirming it. The structural consistency of flood myths worldwide demonstrating careful preservation rather than creative elaboration. 3 possible explanations emerged. Pure coincidence? Rejected. The statistical probability is too small, and the geological evidence too specific. Archetypal psychology. Interesting, but it doesn't explain why the myths correlate with actual geological events, or why they contain practical details like boat dimensions and bird species. Historical memory? This is where the evidence points. Flood myths preserve genuine human experience of catastrophic flooding during post-glacial sea level rise, mythologized and theologized as cultures wrapped real events in their religious frameworks, but fundamentally historical. We're not claiming certainty. We're not saying we've proven every detail. But historical memory is the most parsimonious explanation, the simplest answer that accounts for all the evidence, the interpretation that makes sense of both the global pattern of myths and the geological record of catastrophe. They remembered because it happened. The water rose catastrophically. Coastal civilizations drowned. Survivors fled to mountains and transmitted warnings through oral tradition that survived 10,000 years to reach us today. But this isn't just ancient history. This isn't just about the past. Because if this pattern is real, it changes how we understand ourselves, our history, and our future. We're not the first civilization. We're just the latest. And everything the first ones built is 400 feet underwater. If we take flood myths seriously as historical memory, several implications follow that should fundamentally change how we understand human civilization. First, we're older than we think. The standard narrative says civilization began around 5,000 years ago. Writing, cities, organized states, complex agriculture, all emerging in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and the Indus Valley around 3000 BCE. Before that, Primitive hunter-gatherers, small bands, simple societies gradually developing toward complexity. But if advanced coastal civilizations existed 13,000 years ago and were destroyed by catastrophic flooding, that narrative is wrong. We're not the first to reach sophistication. We're survivors, rebuilding from catastrophe. The sudden appearance of agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, and monumental architecture around 3000 BCE might not represent invention. It might represent recovery, rediscovery, knowledge preserved through the dark ages after the flood, finally finding fertile ground again once climate stabilized and populations recovered. Second, progress isn't linear. We like to imagine human history as steady advancement from primitive to sophisticated, from ignorant to knowledgeable, from simple to complex. But if flood myths preserve real catastrophe, history looks different. Cyclical rather than linear, rising and falling, advancing, collapsing, losing knowledge, rebuilding from fragments, advancing again. The archaeological record hints at this. Sophisticated accomplishments appearing without visible developmental stages. Monuments built with precision we struggle to replicate. Knowledge encoded in structures that seems too advanced for their supposed era. Maybe that's not anomalous. Maybe that's normal. Maybe civilizations reach heights, fall, and the survivors carry forward what fragments they can preserve until conditions allow rebuilding. Third, oral traditions deserve profound respect. If flood myths are proven historical memory, and the evidence increasingly suggests they are, then other myths might preserve genuine knowledge about the deep past. Stories dismissed as fantasy might contain historical cause. Oral histories treated as primitive superstition might maintain accurate information across thousands of years. Western academia has been biased toward written records, assuming oral tradition is inherently unreliable. But Aboriginal Australians remembered coastlines for 10,000 years. Flood myths worldwide preserved structural consistency across hundreds of generations. Maybe we should stop dismissing oral tradition and start taking it seriously as legitimate historical transmission. Fourth, we live in amnesia. We've forgotten that catastrophe is normal on geological timescales. Our stable Holocene period, the past 11,000 years of relatively calm climate that allowed civilization to flourish, is anomalous. For most of human existence, the environment was chaotic. Ice ages, rapid climate shifts, megafauna extinctions, population crashes. The world has ended before, multiple times, and it could end again. But we've forgotten this. We assume stability. We build cities at sea level as though seas are permanent features. We construct complex, fragile systems as though disruption is impossible. We advance technologically without corresponding wisdom about managing that power. We're making the same assumptions every civilization makes. We're special. We're different. Catastrophe can't happen to us. The flood survivors who transmitted these stories understood something we've forgotten. Everything is temporary. Sophistication is fragile. Preservation requires effort. Knowledge must be protected because it can be lost. The world can change catastrophically. And when it does, geography matters more than merit. Luck matters more than wisdom. And survival requires humility. Flood myths aren't just teaching us that water rose. They're teaching us about time, change, fragility, and the human condition. They're saying, you think you're permanent, but you're not. You think your knowledge is secure, but it isn't. You think tomorrow will resemble today, but it might not. But this isn't just about understanding the past. If flood myths preserve memory of real catastrophe, then they also preserve a warning. Because what happened once can happen again. They survived to warn us. They passed down the memory for 10,000 years. And we're not listening. Many flood traditions explicitly frame themselves as warnings. Noah is commanded to tell future generations about the covenant, about what happened, about why the rainbow appears. Survivors in countless cultures are instructed to remember, to teach their children, to maintain awareness that catastrophe is possible. The stories aren't entertainment. They're alarm systems, cultural warning mechanisms maintained across centuries. What are they warning us about? Obviously, flooding, seas that can rise, waters that can cover the world. But the deeper warning isn't about specific mechanisms. It's about catastrophe itself, about the reality that civilizations fall, that the world can change suddenly and violently, that nothing is permanent, that what seems stable can collapse. We face our own catastrophic risks, some similar to ancient floods. Climate change causing sea level rise, though more slowly than younger dryers, but affecting billions more people. Most coastal cities built at elevations that assume seas won't change. Miami, Shanghai, Mumbai, Lagos, Bangkok, all vulnerable, not to 40-day floods, but to century-long rises that will still displace populations and destroy infrastructure on scales we can barely imagine. But we also face risks ancient peoples never encountered. Nuclear weapons capable of ending civilization in hours. Biological weapons that could trigger pandemics worse than any natural disease. Artificial intelligence advancing toward capabilities we might not control. Ecological collapse from simultaneous pressures on multiple systems. Technological fragility, where single points of failure, electromagnetic pulses, cyber attacks, supply chain disruptions, could cascade through entire civilizations. The pattern is the same though. Advancing capability without corresponding wisdom, power without ethics, complexity creating fragility, systems optimized for efficiency becoming vulnerable to disruption. The same hubris that flood myths warn against. Assuming we're special, assuming we're safe, assuming catastrophe can't happen to us. The lesson flood survivors learned at terrible cost was this: civilizations fall, knowledge is lost, warnings are forgotten, and hubris invites catastrophe. The deepest meaning of flood myths isn't the water, it's the forgetting. Every civilization thinks it's permanent. Every society assumes its knowledge is secure. Every generation believes it can't happen to us right up until the moment it does. The Mesopotamians thought their civilization would last forever. The coastal peoples during the Ice Age had no reason to think the seas would rise. They'd lived on those shores for thousands of years. The water had always been there at that level. Why would it change? But it did change. catastrophically, and everything they'd built drowned. We're making the same assumption. We think our civilization is stable. We think our knowledge is secure. Digital archives, cloud storage, distributed systems. We think catastrophe is something that happened to ancient peoples, primitive societies without our technology and sophistication. But sophistication makes us fragile. Our complex systems have more failure points. Our specialized knowledge means fewer people understand foundational processes. Our optimization for efficiency has eliminated redundancy that provided resilience. The flood myths are trying to tell us something. Catastrophe is always possible. Preparation matters. Humility is survival. Memory serves as protection. Don't assume tomorrow will resemble today. Don't assume your world is permanent. Don't assume warnings don't apply to you. They survived to warn us. They made certain their descendants would know that the world had ended before, that it could end again, that the signs should be recognized, that preparation should happen before crisis, not during. And we're not listening. We're dismissing the stories as primitive mythology. We're ignoring the warnings because they come wrapped in religious frameworks we don't share. We're assuming our technology makes us immune to the forces that destroyed previous civilizations. But the water is still there. The ice sheets are still melting. The climate is still changing. The risks are still real. And the pattern keeps repeating. Advancement without wisdom, power without ethics, complexity without resilience, hubris without humility. So we've traced the pattern across the world, through time, from myth to geology to meaning. But there's one question left, the most personal question. What do we do with this? How should understanding this change us? The people who survived the flood are your ancestors. Their trauma is in your genes. Their warnings are in your stories. They're trying to reach you across 10,000 years. We're deep into the night now. That hour when thoughts become different, when the boundaries between past and present feel thinner, when connections across time feel more real than they do in daylight. And in this liminal space, we can ask more intimate questions about what these flood myths really mean, not to civilizations or cultures, but to you personally. You're connected to the people who survived catastrophic flooding, not metaphorically, literally, through DNA, through unbroken chains of descent, through genetic inheritance that links you to every human who ever lived. The survivors who transmitted flood stories are your actual ancestors. Their blood runs in your veins. Their memories live in your inherited traditions. Think about what that means. Somewhere in your lineage, someone watched the world drown. Someone saw the waters rise beyond anything imaginable. Someone fled inland while everyone they knew died. Someone huddled on a mountain while the seas covered everything below. Someone survived through geography and luck and determination, then made certain their children knew what happened. That impulse, to remember, to warn, to preserve, echoes across 130 centuries to reach you right now, in this moment, listening to these words. They're trying to tell you something. Across impossible spans of time, through oral traditions that survived the collapse of civilizations, through stories that outlasted empires, Your ancestors are speaking. Imagine yourself there. The coast, 12,900 years ago. You're living in a thriving settlement. You fish, you trade, you know hundreds of people. Your community has existed here for generations. The sea is where it's always been. Life is stable. Then the sky changes. Maybe impact. Maybe just climate chaos. Whatever the mechanism, the waters start rising. Not gradually, catastrophically. Within your lifetime, within years or decades, everything you know drowns. The settlements, the trade networks, the specialists who know how to build, how to track stars, how to preserve knowledge. Your friends, your family, most of your community, gone beneath the advancing water. You survive because you fled inland early enough, because you were visiting relatives in the mountains when it happened, because luck and geography favored you. And now you're a refugee in lands already inhabited, competing for resources, trying to rebuild some fraction of what was lost. What do you tell your children? You tell them what happened. You make them remember. You encode it in story, in ritual, in sacred narrative that must be repeated exactly, that cannot be allowed to fade. Because forgetting would dishonor everyone who died. Because the warning might save future descendants. Because the connection to those who came before matters more than comfort. That's not hypothetical. That happened to your ancestors, and they succeeded in transmitting the memory to you through hundreds of generations, through migrations and collapses and dark ages, through the invention and loss and reinvention of writing, through all the chaos of history. The message survived. Studying flood myths isn't academic exercise. It's communion with ancestors. It's touching something that reaches back to the edge of memory, to the boundary between myth and history, to the reality that we're part of a story so much larger and longer than our individual lives. In an age of individualism, where we're disconnected from extended family, from community, from any sense of continuity beyond our immediate experience, flood myths reconnect us to deep time. They remind us that we're not isolated atoms. We're part of an unbroken human chain stretching back to people who survived world-ending catastrophe and forward to descendants we'll never meet. The survivors are reaching across time to warn you, to connect with you, to remind you that you carry their persistence, their resilience, their refusal to let the story end. You exist because they survived, because they preserved what mattered, because they transmitted warnings even when doing so seemed futile. But it's not just about connecting backward to those who survived. It's about connecting forward to those who will come after us. Because we're not just descendants. We're also ancestors. Someday, your descendants will tell stories about you, about the world you lived in, about what you did when you knew catastrophe was possible. What will they say? There's a philosophical shift that happens when you realize you're not just descended from someone, you're also someone's ancestor. Future generations, whether you're biological descendants or cultural descendants or simply the humans who come after, will look back at you the way you're looking back at flood survivors. What will you transmit to them? If catastrophe struck tomorrow, climate collapse, nuclear exchange, pandemic, electromagnetic pulse, cascading infrastructure failure, any of the scenarios that keep you awake some nights, what knowledge would survive? What warnings would you pass down? What would future humans say about your generation? Here's an uncomfortable truth. We're more fragile than the people who survived the flood. More capable, yes. More technologically advanced, absolutely. But more resilient, less so. Most of us can't grow food, can't build shelter from raw materials, can't create tools, can't start fire without matches or lighters, can't navigate without GPS, can't preserve food without refrigeration, can't communicate without infrastructure. We've gained capability, but lost fundamental resilience. Our knowledge exists in formats that wouldn't survive disruption. Digital archives require electricity, functional computers, compatible software, intact internet infrastructure. Specialized expertise means no individual understands complete systems. The people who design microchips don't know how to refine silicon. The people who refine silicon don't know how to mine it. The people who mine it don't know how to design chips. Break any link in those chains, and the knowledge becomes inaccessible. Ancient peoples who transmitted flood myths understood something we've forgotten. Knowledge must be preserved in catastrophe-resistant forms. Stories survive when libraries burn. Songs preserve information when texts are destroyed. Oral traditions maintained by communities persist when individual experts die. Practical skills passed through apprenticeship continue when theoretical knowledge becomes useless. This isn't doom prophecy. This is philosophical framework. We have responsibility to future generations, not just to avoid catastrophe, though that matters, but to prepare for its possibility. To preserve what's worth preserving in forms that could survive disruption. What should we preserve? Not everything. That's impossible. But certain things matter more than others. Practical skills that don't require infrastructure. How to grow food. How to purify water. How to build shelter. How to make tools. How to preserve food. How to treat injuries. Foundational knowledge that remains useful regardless of what collapses. Moral frameworks that survived previous collapses. The flood myths themselves, actually. The warnings about hubris. The emphasis on humility. The recognition that catastrophe is possible. The value of community over isolation. The importance of preserving knowledge rather than assuming it's permanent. And stories, especially stories. Because if we survive to transmit our own flood myths to future generations, they need to hear not just what happened, but what we learned. They need to know we recognized the risks. They need to understand we tried to address them, or that we didn't, or that we succeeded, or that we failed. What will they say about us? That we had warnings and heeded them? Or that we had warnings and ignored them? That we preserved what mattered? Or that we optimized for efficiency and created fragility? That we prepared for catastrophe? Or that we assumed it couldn't happen to us? The flood survivors transmitted warnings because they understood being ancestors means carrying responsibility forward, not just receiving inheritance backward. They preserved knowledge in forms that could survive: oral traditions, ritual practices, sacred narratives protected by community. They taught resilience alongside sophistication. We have opportunity to do the same, to preserve knowledge in robust forms. Physical books alongside digital archives, practical skills alongside theoretical understanding, distributed systems alongside centralized ones, community bonds alongside individual capability. To teach our children things that don't require electricity or internet or intact supply chains. To create memory systems that could survive disruption. Not because catastrophe is inevitable, because it's possible, and possibility requires preparation. Understanding that we're ancestors means recognizing that what we preserve, what we teach, what we transmit matters beyond our individual lives. The survivors reached across time to warn us. We can reach across time to warn, or prepare, or guide those who come after. The chain of transmission doesn't end with us. We're links, not termination points. But we're not just links in a chain between past and future. We're here, now, alive in this moment. So what does understanding all this mean for how we live? Knowing the world ended before doesn't make you afraid. It makes you alive. It makes you aware. It makes you ready. So how should understanding flood myths as historical memory and warning change how you live today, right now, in this specific moment of your specific life? First, it teaches humility, recognizing that our civilization is fragile, that our knowledge is impermanent, that our assumptions could be catastrophically wrong. This makes us less arrogant, more cautious about risks, more willing to question whether the trajectory we're on is sustainable, more open to acknowledging that maybe, possibly, we're making mistakes that will matter. The civilizations that drowned thought they were permanent too. Every society assumes it's special, that catastrophe happens to other people, that their world will continue indefinitely. Understanding. We're not exempt from patterns that destroyed previous civilizations, creates healthy humility. Second, it teaches appreciation. If everything is temporary, and it is, then the present becomes more precious. Every day of peace and stability is gift, not guarantee. Every moment with people you love matters more when you understand nothing is permanent. Every experience becomes richer when you recognize the world could change, and this specific moment will never return. The flood survivors understood this. They'd watched stability dissolve. They knew how quickly normal becomes catastrophe. That knowledge didn't make them nihilistic. It made them value what they had while they had it. Third, it teaches preparation, not paranoid survivalism, not bunkers and weapons and isolation, but thoughtful resilience. Learning practical skills that don't require infrastructure, maintaining physical books alongside digital libraries, teaching children things that remain useful if systems fail, building community connections because isolation is vulnerability, creating redundancy rather than optimizing everything for maximum efficiency. The people who transmitted flood myths prepared their descendants for possibility of catastrophe. The stories functioned as warning systems, maintaining awareness that the world can change, that preparation matters, that recognizing signs early enough makes difference between survival and drowning. Fourth, it teaches responsibility. Understanding that catastrophe is possible motivates addressing existential risks before they manifest. Climate change, nuclear weapons, pandemic preparedness, AI safety, ecological preservation. These aren't abstract concerns. They're patterns the flood myths warn about. Power without wisdom, advancement without ethics, capability without corresponding responsibility. We have opportunity to break the pattern, to recognize risks early, to prepare while preparation is still possible, to learn from warnings preserved across 10,000 years, instead of learning through experiencing catastrophe ourselves. Fifth, it teaches wonder. Realizing human history is deeper and stranger than mainstream narratives portray reconnects us with mystery. The world becomes more interesting when you understand oral traditions preserve actual history, when you recognize that much of human story is lost underwater, when you accept that what we think we know is fragment of larger reality. Flood myths teach us to hold multiple truths simultaneously. Civilization is precious and fragile. Knowledge is powerful and vulnerable. Life is beautiful and temporary. Catastrophe is unlikely but possible. We can prepare without paranoia. We can appreciate without complacency. We can acknowledge fragility without abandoning hope. For thousands of years, children fell asleep hearing stories of waters rising and survivors persisting, of worlds ending and beginning again, of catastrophe survived and warnings transmitted. Those stories taught something important. The world can end and we can survive. Loss is real, but so is resilience. Everything changes, but something continues. Understanding flood myths doesn't make you afraid of the future. It makes you alive to the present, aware of possibilities, ready for change, connected to deep time and deep purpose. Part of story that began long before you and continues long after. The survivors transmitted warnings because they cared about descendants they'd never meet. We can do the same, not through fear, but through awareness. Not through despair, but through preparation. Not through isolation, but through connection to past, to future, to each other. So we've traveled from ancient tablets to geological records, from global mythology to personal meaning. We've asked why every culture remembers the same catastrophe. Now in these final moments, we bring everything together, because this story isn't finished. It's still being written. You stayed with us through every story, every culture, every layer of evidence. Thank you. Because now you see what they saw. You remember what they remembered. You know what they knew. Let's trace back one final time through the journey we've taken together through these long hours of night. We began with a pattern that shouldn't exist. Over 200 cultures across every inhabited continent, preserving flood myths with details too specific to dismiss as coincidence. Not vague stories about rain, but precise narratives. Divine warnings, boats and constructed to exact specifications. Animals preserved in pairs, tresors covering mountains. birds sent to test for land, landing on peaks. Humanity beginning again from near extinction. We explored those stories in their original contexts. In Mesopotamia, where clay tablets from 4,000 years ago described Utnapishtim's 7-day storm and Atrahasis's regret-filled gods. In the Americas, where Aztec world ages ended in drowning and Mayan wooden people were destroyed by floods and darkness, where Ojibwe, Hopi, and dozens of other nations remembered water rising beyond anything normal. In Asia, where Matsya towed Manu to Himalayan peaks, and Yu fought floods for 13 years to save Chinese civilization. In the Pacific, where ocean peoples who lived their entire lives surrounded by water still feared it because they remembered when it rose and swallowed lands. In Europe, where Noah's Ark became Western culture's dominant narrative, but Greek and Norse traditions independently preserved memories of catastrophic flooding. The pattern was undeniable. These cultures couldn't have borrowed from each other. They developed in isolation, separated by oceans that couldn't be crossed, by distances that couldn't be traveled, by barriers that couldn't be breached. Yet they all told the same story. Then we shifted from mythology to geology, and the earth confirmed what the stories claimed. Catastrophic sea level rise during the exact period the myths describe. Meltwater pulses when seas rose tens of meters in decades. The Younger Dryas period showing possible cosmic impacts. Continent-scale wildfires. Sudden megafauna extinction. Rapid climate chaos. 400 feet of sea level difference between Ice Age and today, drowning millions of square kilometers, where human populations would have concentrated on coastal plains. We examined survival patterns. Geography determined who lived more than sophistication. Coastal civilizations drowned while mountain populations persisted through luck of elevation. The genetic bottleneck suggesting human population crashed to perhaps 10,000 individuals. We explored how oral tradition preserves accurate information across 10 millennia. Aboriginal Australians proving it works. The structural consistency of flood myths worldwide, demonstrating careful preservation rather than creative elaboration. 3 explanations emerged. Coincidence? Impossible given the statistical improbability and geological correlation. Archetypal psychology? Interesting, but doesn't explain practical details or geological timing. Historical memory? This is where all evidence points. Flood myths preserve genuine human experience of catastrophic flooding, mythologized as cultures wrapped real events in religious frameworks, but fundamentally historical. We can't claim certainty about every detail. We can't prove exactly what happened or how sophisticated pre-flood civilizations were. But we can say with reasonable confidence, catastrophic flooding occurred around 12,000 years ago. It destroyed coastal civilizations. Survivors fled to high ground. They transmitted warnings through oral tradition that survived to reach us today. The shift from "these are myths" to "these are memories" changes everything. Not literal recordings, but genuine preservation of human experience, distorted by time and theology and transmission, but fundamentally rooted in real catastrophe that real people survived. This is victory of human memory over catastrophe, of oral tradition over time, of connection over isolation. The survivors wanted us to know. They made certain the message would reach across 130 centuries. And it did. Against all odds, through collapses and dark ages and lost civilizations, the warning survived. You stayed through the entire journey. You followed the pattern across continents. You examined the evidence in rocks and ice. You connected with ancestors across impossible time. That matters. Your curiosity matters. Your willingness to question familiar narratives and see ancient stories in new ways matters. But knowledge isn't the end. Understanding isn't the destination. Because this story, the story of catastrophe and survival, loss and memory, endings and beginnings, this story is still happening. We're in it now. They left warnings carved in story, preserved across centuries. We received the warnings. Now we have to decide what we do with them. We're living in what future generations might call after the flood. Not literally, though seas are rising. But in the pattern, we face our own potential catastrophes, our own existential risks, our own moment of decision about whether we're wise enough to survive what we're capable of creating. Climate change is causing sea level rise, slower than younger, drier meltwater pulses, but affecting billions more people. Miami, Shanghai, Mumbai, Bangkok, Lagos. Coastal cities built at elevations assuming seas won't change. We're literally repeating the pattern. Concentrated populations on coasts, rising waters, eventual displacement or drowning. But beyond climate, we face risks ancient peoples never encountered. Nuclear weapons capable of ending civilization in hours. Biological weapons that could trigger pandemics worse than any natural disease. Artificial intelligence advancing toward capabilities we might not control. Ecological collapse from simultaneous pressures on multiple systems. Technological fragility, where electromagnetic pulses or cyber attacks or supply chain disruptions cascade through civilization. The pattern is the same though. Advancing capability without corresponding wisdom. Power without ethics. Complexity creating fragility. Systems optimized for efficiency becoming vulnerable to single points of failure. The same hubris flood myths warn against. Assuming we're special. Assuming we're safe. Assuming catastrophe happens to other people in other times but never to us. Future generations will look back at us the way we look back at flood survivors. They'll ask the same questions. Did they know? Did they see it coming? Could they have prevented it? Did they try? What will they say about us? That we had warnings. Ancient ones preserved for 10,000 years. Modern ones from our own scientists. And heeded them. Or ignored them. That we recognized the risks and addressed them while there was still time. Or that we saw the dangers and continued anyway, because changing course seemed too difficult. That we preserved knowledge in forms that could survive disruption. Or that we optimized everything for efficiency and created fragility. That we prepared future generations with resilience and wisdom. Or that we left them infrastructure they couldn't maintain and knowledge they couldn't access. We have advantage flood survivors didn't. We have their warnings. Preserved across unimaginable time, maintained through catastrophes and collapses, reaching us encoded in stories every culture tells. They're teaching us that catastrophe is real, that civilization is fragile, that preparation matters, that hubris invites destruction. They survived to warn us. They made certain the message would reach us, and we received it. The question now is whether we'll listen. Flood myths survived because people chose to preserve them. Communities protected the stories. Elders taught them to children. Cultures embedded them in sacred rituals. Generation after generation made the conscious decision that this knowledge mattered enough to maintain. We can make the same choice. We can choose to preserve what matters for whatever comes next. Not just knowledge, but wisdom. Not just capability, but resilience. Not just sophistication, but humility. We can choose to address risks before they become catastrophes. To prepare while preparation is possible. To learn from warnings rather than through experiencing disaster. To break the pattern instead of repeating it. Or we can assume we're different. Assume our technology makes us immune. Assume catastrophe won't happen because it hasn't happened yet in our experience. Assume tomorrow will resemble today, just like every civilization that drowned assumed the seas would stay where they'd always been. The survivors are still speaking across time. The warnings are still there in every culture's oldest stories. The pattern is still visible to anyone willing to see it. The choice is ours. So we end where we began, with a mystery. But it's a different mystery now. Not, why does every culture remember the same catastrophe? We know why. The question now is, what do we do with this knowledge? How does it change us? The greatest mystery isn't what happened. It's what it means. And that meaning, what you take from this, how it changes you, what you do with this knowledge, that's yours to discover. We've reached the deepest part of night, that hour when most people are sleeping, when the world is quiet, when thoughts become different than they are in daylight. You're in that space between waking and sleeping, where big truths settle in, where connections across time feel real, where the boundary between myth and history and personal meaning dissolves. Remember the beginning. The researcher surrounded by ancient texts, seeing the pattern emerge. The impossible consistency across cultures that never met. The same story told in different languages, wrapped in different theologies, but preserving the same core memory. Now you are that researcher. You've taken the journey. You've followed the pattern from Mesopotamia to the Americas, from Asia to Europe, from the Pacific to your own moment in time. You've seen what they saw. The geological evidence, the oral traditions, the warnings preserved across 130 centuries. You've connected with ancestors who survived world-ending catastrophe and made certain you would know what they knew. And there's something strange about that connection, isn't there? Something that makes you feel simultaneously small and vast. Small because you're one individual against geological timeframes, against forces that can drown worlds, against time that erases everything eventually. But vast because you're part of an unbroken chain reaching back to Ice Age survivors and forward to descendants you'll never meet. Part of a story that began before recorded history and continues beyond anything you'll witness. Tomorrow, you'll wake up, return to normal life. And this might feel like a strange dream. Did I really spend hours thinking about flood myths? About catastrophes from 12,000 years ago? About warnings preserved in stories most people dismiss as fantasy? But something will have changed. You'll notice flood stories everywhere now, in movies, in books, in conversations. You'll think about rising seas differently when you see news about coastal cities. You'll feel connected to deeper time, to longer patterns, to meanings that extend beyond immediate experience. The world will seem simultaneously more fragile and more resilient, more temporary and more continuous. Because the final mystery isn't what happened to ancient civilizations. We've explored that. The evidence points to catastrophic flooding, coastal populations drowned, survivors transmitted warnings. That's history. The mystery is what it means. To you, personally, in your specific life at this specific moment. For some, the meaning is preparation, learning skills that don't require infrastructure, building resilience, creating systems that could survive disruption, taking warnings seriously. For others, the meaning is connection, feeling linked to ancestors across vast time, understanding you're part of something larger than yourself, recognizing that your actions ripple forward to descendants you'll never meet. For others, the meaning is wonder, realizing human history is deeper and stranger than you thought, accepting that much remains unknown, finding beauty in mystery. For others still, the meaning is humility, understanding that civilizations fall, that knowledge is fragile, that nothing is permanent, that catastrophe is possible even when it seems impossible. The documentary doesn't prescribe which meaning is correct. They're all valid. The survivors transmitted warnings not to create fear, but to create awareness. Not to guarantee disaster, but to prevent it. Not to make you despair, but to make you ready. Picture the water. Quiet now, covering lands that used to be inhabited, holding secrets 400 feet below the surface. Remembering what happened when the ice melted and the seas rose and the world changed. The water remembers. It doesn't judge. It doesn't warn. It just is. Patient, eternal. Capable of drowning everything or sustaining everything, depending on where you stand in relation to it. Picture the stones. Ancient monuments built with precision we struggle to match. Carved with warnings in languages, some living, some dead, whispering what they witnessed, if you know how to listen. The stones remember. They preserve. They endure. Picture the survivors, your ancestors, standing on mountains while the world drowned below, making the decision to remember, to transmit, to warn, speaking across 130 centuries, trying to reach you. And you, late at night, alone with your thoughts, tired but alert, finally listening. Every culture remembers the same catastrophe. Now you know why. Now you remember too. The story continues, and you're part of it now. The water is quiet tonight. The stones are patient. The warnings are there. What you do with this knowledge, how it changes you, what you preserve and transmit to those who come after. That's your part of the story to write. Sleep well. The survivors are still with you. Their persistence is in your blood. Their warnings are in your stories. Their hope that you would listen, that you would understand, that you would be ready. That hope has been realized. You heard them across impossible time. And tomorrow, when you wake, the world will still be here. Changed, perhaps. Or perhaps the same. But you will be different. Because you've traveled through deep time tonight. You've touched something ancient and essential. You've remembered what we all forgot. That the world can end. That we can survive. That stories matter. That memory serves as protection. That nothing is permanent but something continues. The pattern is complete. The circle closes. The story continues. And you're part of it now. You always were. You just know it now.